Carl Jung explained why she's happier alone than chasing half-hearted love. There is a golden light that falls across the faces of women who have forgotten their own names. It is the light of borrowed dreams, reflected from surfaces that promise everything, while delivering only the echo of their own yearning back to them. This light creates shadows, not the rich, fertile shadows that Jung spoke of as the gateway to wholeness, but the thin, desperate shadows of lives lived in imitation of something that was never truly theirs to begin with. You know this light. You have walked in its glow, felt its warmth on your skin, mistaken its reflection for the sun itself. It illuminates the gilded cage that society has built for the modern woman's heart, a cage so beautiful, so admired by others, that she mistakes her captivity for freedom, her constraint for choice. In this cage, love becomes performance. Relationship becomes role-playing. The heart becomes an instrument tuned to frequencies that are not its own, creating music that pleases everyone except the soul that houses it. Jung would recognize this immediately. The triumph of the persona over the authentic self. The costume becoming so convincing that even the wearer forgets there is a living, breathing woman beneath the mask. This is where your story begins, not in darkness, but in light. The wrong kind of light, the kind that blinds rather than illuminates, that flatters rather than reveals, that promises salvation while delivering only deeper imprisonment. You have been living in the mythology of someone else's love story, following breadcrumbs laid down by voices that were never meant to guide your particular path. The collective unconscious whispers its ancient patterns through modern channels, magazine articles that promise to reveal what men want, social media feeds that showcase perfect relationships, like museum pieces, friends and family whose well-meaning advice carries the weight of their own unlived lives. These voices create a symphony of expectation that drowns out the quiet, persistent song of your own heart. A song so soft, so genuinely yours, that it takes the deepest silence to hear it. Jung understood that we are born into a world that immediately begins the process of teaching us to abandon ourselves. The persona, that mask we wear to navigate social waters, starts forming before we even have a clear sense of who we are beneath it. For women, this process is particularly insidious because the persona of femininity comes preloaded with centuries of archetypal expectations about love, relationship, and self-worth. You learned early that your value was connected to your ability to attract and maintain love. Not the love that flows from recognition of your essential being, but the love that must be earned through performance, maintained through constant vigilance, and measured by external markers of success. This love always exists just outside of you, requiring you to reach toward it, shape yourself around it, become smaller or larger or different than you naturally are in order to deserve it. The gilded cage is built from these adaptations. Each time you swallowed your true opinion to keep peace, each time you laughed at jokes that weren't funny to make someone comfortable, each time you waited by the phone instead of going out into the world to follow your own curiosity, another golden bar was added to the structure that would eventually surround your authentic self so completely that you could barely remember what it felt like to move freely. But here is what Jung knew, what the ancient myths understood, what your deepest self has been trying to tell you through dreams and restlessness and that persistent feeling that something essential is missing. The cage was always unlocked. The door has never been barred from the inside. What keeps you trapped is not force, but enchantment. Not external power, but internal conditioning. Not the absence of choice, but the fear of what choosing authentically might cost you. This fear is not irrational. The cost is real. To step out of the gilded cage means stepping out of the agreed-upon story about who you are supposed to be and what you are supposed to want. It means disappointing people who have invested in your performance of femininity. It means facing the possibility that the love you have been seeking, the love that requires you to be someone other than yourself, might not exist for the woman you actually are. But there is another kind of love waiting. Jung called it the love that arises from individuation, the love that becomes possible when two people meet not as incomplete halves seeking wholeness in each other, but as whole beings choosing to share their wholeness. This love cannot be found while you remain in the cage, because the cage is built specifically to prevent you from discovering your own completeness. The modern woman's journey begins with a growing awareness of the bars. Perhaps it comes as a sudden shock, the realization that you have been living someone else's life, that the relationships you have pursued have been based more on projection than perception, more on need than recognition. Or perhaps it arrives slowly, like dawn breaking, a gradual illumination that reveals the landscape you have been walking in was not the territory of your own choosing. Either way, the awakening is uncomfortable. Jung spoke of enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite. The very strategies that once brought you a sense of safety and belonging begin to feel suffocating. The persona that once felt like protection begins to feel like a prison. The relationships that once provided validation begin to feel like elaborate performances that leave you more alone than ever. This is Persephone's moment in the meadow, gathering flowers that someone else has planted, in patterns someone else has designed, for reasons that have nothing to do with her own deep nature. She is beautiful in this meadow, admired, safe, and completely disconnected from her own underworld depths. The flowers she gathers are lovely, but they are not rooted in the soil of her own being. They wilt quickly, requiring her to return again and again to gather more, never quite satisfying the deeper hunger that she cannot yet name. The shadow lover appears in this meadow. He is everything the collective unconscious has taught you to desire. Charming, elusive, promising, exciting. He offers just enough attention to keep you gathering flowers, but never quite enough to allow you to rest in the certainty of being loved for who you are rather than what you provide. He is not evil, he is simply a projection of your own unlived potential, dressed up as a person and placed just out of reach. Jung observed that we fall in love with our own unconscious contents, projected onto another person. The shadow lover embodies everything you have not yet developed in yourself. Confidence, creativity, freedom, power, mystery. Instead of recognizing these as your own unlived capacities, you see them as qualities that exist only in him, that you can access only through relationship with him. This creates a kind of psychological dependency that masquerades as love, but is actually a form of self-abandonment. The shadow lover knows exactly how to keep you in the meadow. He appears when you are beginning to wander toward the edges, when your curiosity about your own depths is starting to awaken. He provides just enough connection to remind you why you are here, just enough validation to keep you believing that this meadow contains everything you need, just enough promise to prevent you from wondering what lies beyond its carefully maintained borders. But the deeper self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, is not content to remain in meadows, no matter how beautiful. The self calls toward integration, toward wholeness, toward the dark, fertile ground where authentic growth becomes possible. This call begins as a whisper, easily ignored, easily rationalized away, but it grows stronger with each flower that fails to satisfy, each shadow lover who disappears just as you were beginning to trust, each moment of recognizing that you are living a life that looks right from the outside, but feels hollow from within. The gilded cage begins to feel less like protection and more like restriction. the meadow begins to feel less like paradise and more like a beautiful prison. The shadow lover begins to reveal himself not as a real person worthy of love, but as a symbol of everything you have been afraid to become yourself. And in this recognition, painful, disorienting, but ultimately liberating, the first crack appears in the structure that has been containing your true life. This crack is not destruction, it is possibility. It is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person becomes who they truly are rather than who they have been conditioned to be. For the woman who has been living in borrowed dreams, this process begins with the radical act of questioning everything she has been told about love, relationship, and her own worth. What if the love you have been seeking is not the love you actually need? What if the relationships that society celebrates are not the relationships that would feed your soul? What if the version of yourself that others find most attractive is not the version that contains your deepest gifts and most authentic power? These questions are dangerous to the gilded cage. They threaten the entire structure of borrowed dreams. They suggest the possibility that you might be complete without external validation, that you might be lovable as you are rather than as you perform yourself to be, that your own inner landscape might be more interesting and nourishing than the carefully curated meadows where you have been gathering other people's flowers. The persona begins to resist these questions. It has been your protector, your guide, your passport to social acceptance. It knows that questioning the fundamental assumptions about love and relationship could lead to a period of aloneness, uncertainty, and social discomfort that feels threatening to its primary mission of keeping you safe and approved of. The persona whispers, "Don't rock the boat. Don't ask questions that might lead to answers you're not ready for. Keep gathering flowers. Keep believing in shadow lovers. Keep performing the kind of femininity that gets rewarded." But the self, that deeper, wiser part of you that Jung described as your connection to the transpersonal, has different plans. The self is not interested in safety. It is interested in authenticity. It is not concerned with approval. It is concerned with integration. It does not fear aloneness. It recognizes solitude as the natural environment where self-knowledge can flourish. The tension between persona and self creates the psychological pressure that begins to crack the gilded cage. You find yourself in relationships that once felt exciting but now feel repetitive. You notice patterns in your attraction that seem to lead to the same disappointments. You begin to observe your own behavior with a kind of detached curiosity, wondering why you keep making choices that leave you feeling empty even when they look successful from the outside. Jung would recognize this as the beginning of consciousness, the capacity to observe your own psychological processes rather than being completely identified with them. This consciousness is uncomfortable because it reveals the gap between who you have been pretending to be and who you actually are. It shows you the ways you have abandoned yourself in the name of love, the ways you have traded authenticity for acceptance, the ways you have made yourself smaller to fit into relationships that were never designed to hold your full being. This recognition can feel like a crisis, and in many ways it is. Jung understood that psychological growth often requires a breakdown of the structures that have been containing us. The ego, that part of consciousness that has been managing your persona and maintaining your place in the meadow, experiences this breakdown as a threat to its existence. It mobilizes all of its defenses: rationalization, projection, fantasy, and denial. "You're just going through a phase," the ego whispers. "Everyone goes through periods of doubt. The problem isn't with love itself. It's with the particular lovers you've chosen. Try harder, be more attractive, be more interesting, be more available, be more mysterious. Find the right technique, The right approach, the right way of being, and the love you've been seeking will finally arrive. But the self knows better. The self understands that the problem is not with your approach to love. It is with your understanding of what love is. The love you have been seeking is based on incompleteness, the idea that you are half a person who needs another half to become whole. This understanding of love inevitably leads to relationships based on need rather than recognition, on projection rather than perception, on performance rather than authentic meeting. The self calls you toward a different understanding, love as the meeting of two complete beings who choose to share their completeness. This love is not based on need, but on abundance. It does not require you to be anything other than what you are. It does not promise to complete you because it recognizes that you are already whole. This love can only be found by someone who has first learned to love herself, not the performed version of herself that others find attractive, but the complete, complex, imperfect, magnificent being that she actually is. But to find this love, you must first be willing to leave the meadow. You must be willing to crack open the gilded cage and step into the uncertainty that lies beyond its beautiful boundaries. You must be willing to disappoint the voices that have been guiding your choices, to risk the disapproval of those who have invested in your performance, to face the possibility that authentic love might look nothing like what you have been taught to expect. This willingness does not come all at once. It builds slowly, through accumulated moments of recognition that the old way is not working, that the borrowed dreams are not satisfying the deepest hunger, that the shadow lovers are reflections rather than reality. It builds through dreams that call you toward unknown territories, through restlessness that cannot be explained by external circumstances, through a growing sense that your real life is waiting somewhere beyond the edges of everything you have known. Jung called this the call to adventure, the moment when the soul recognizes that its true journey has not yet begun, that everything up until now has been preparation, practice, a kind of dress rehearsal for the real performance of living. For the woman who has been trapped in borrowed dreams, this call comes as both terror and relief. Terror at the prospect of leaving behind everything familiar, relief at the possibility that there might be another way to exist in the world. The call often arrives in the form of loss. A relationship ends not with drama, but with the quiet recognition that you have both been playing roles that no longer fit. A dream lover reveals himself to be ordinary, human, incapable of carrying the projections you have placed upon him. A friend points out patterns in your romantic life that you have been too close to see. A moment of solitude brings not the loneliness you expected, but a strange sense of peace that makes you question why you have been so afraid of being alone. Or the call might come through what seems like success, the realization that you have achieved everything you thought you wanted in love, but still feel empty. The recognition that the relationship that looks perfect from the outside feels hollow from within. The understanding that you have become so skilled at performing desirability that you have forgotten how to simply be yourself with another person. However it arrives, the call disrupts the comfortable unconsciousness of the gilded cage. It introduces questions where there were once certainties, possibilities where there were once limitations, space where there was once confinement. It suggests that the meadow where you have been gathering flowers is not the only landscape available to you, that the shadow lovers who have been capturing your attention are not the only forms that love can take, that the dreams you have been living might not be your dreams at all. This disruption is the beginning of what Jung called the process of individuation, the journey by which a person becomes who they truly are rather than who they have been conditioned to be. For the woman awakening from borrowed dreams, this process begins with the radical act of questioning everything she has been told about love, relationship, and her own worth. It continues with the even more radical act of beginning to discover what she actually wants, needs, and desires when she is not performing for an audience, not seeking approval, not trying to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. The crack in the gilded cage widens. Light begins to enter. Not the reflected light of borrowed dreams, but the direct illumination of consciousness. This light reveals both the beauty and the limitation of the cage, both the comfort it has provided and the growth it has prevented. It shows you that you are more spacious than the container that has been holding you, more complex than the role you have been playing, more capable of love than the version you have been performing. And in this revelation, the first step of the journey begins. Not yet the full withdrawal from the marketplace of hearts, not yet the descent into the underworld of your own depths, but the simple, profound recognition that there is somewhere else to go, that the meadow is not the only landscape, that borrowed dreams are not the only dreams available, that the woman you have been is not the only woman you can become. The golden light still falls across your face, but now you see it for what it is. Reflection rather than source, surface rather than depth, performance rather than being. And in this seeing, the possibility of another kind of light begins to dawn, the light that comes from within, that needs no external source to sustain it, that illuminates not just the meadow but the vast territories that lie beyond its borders. This is where transformation begins, not in the dramatic gesture of throwing open the cage door, but in the quiet recognition that the door has always been unlocked, that freedom has always been a choice, that the life you have been living is not the only life available to you. The borrowed dreams begin to lose their hold. The shadow lovers begin to reveal their essential emptiness. The golden cage begins to transform from protection into prison, from comfort into constraint, from the place where you live into the place you are preparing to leave. But leaving requires preparation. It requires understanding what you are leaving behind and why. It requires recognizing the difference between the love you have been seeking and the love that might actually nourish you. It requires developing a relationship with solitude, with your own company, with the woman who exists, when no one is watching, when no performance is required, when there is no one to please or impress or attract. This preparation is the work of the hermit, not the bitter withdrawal of someone who has given up on love, but the sacred retreat of someone who is preparing for a deeper kind of loving. Jung understood this withdrawal as a necessary stage of individuation, a time when the soul learns to commune with itself before it can authentically commune with another. The hermit carries a lantern not because the world is dark, but because the light needed for the journey must come from within. You are standing at the threshold of this withdrawal, still in the meadow but beginning to see its edges, still in the cage but feeling the spaciousness that lies beyond its golden bars. The borrowed dreams are losing their power to enchant you. The shadow lovers are revealing their essential emptiness. The persona that has been your guide is beginning to feel like a costume that no longer fits. And in this space between what was and what might be, between the life you have been living and the life that is calling you, the real journey begins. The journey toward yourself, toward authenticity, toward the kind of love that can only be found by someone who has first learned to be complete in her own company, whole in her own being, at home in the vast landscape of her own soul. In the twilight spaces between connection and emptiness, where hope meets disappointment in an endless dance, he appears, the shadow lover. He is not a person, though he wears the face of many. He is not real, though he feels more vivid than anything else in your carefully constructed world. He is the phantom who feeds on the gap between who you are and who you might become, the seductive voice that promises completion while delivering only fragments of yourself, reflected back through the mirror of projected desire. Jung understood this figure intimately. He saw how the animus, that unconscious masculine aspect within the feminine psyche, could become a hungry ghost when not integrated, a projected force that appears to live in others but actually dwells within the unlived portions of your own soul. The shadow lover is this animus in its most seductive and destructive form, the part of you that you cannot see, dressed up as the person you cannot live without. He arrives precisely when the gilded cage begins to feel too small, when the borrowed dreams start to lose their shine, when your authentic self begins stirring in the depths, like a creature awakening from hibernation. He appears as salvation from your growing consciousness, a detour back into the familiar territory of projection and fantasy, a way to avoid the difficult work of meeting yourself in the solitude that true transformation requires. The shadow lover knows exactly when to appear because he is created by your own psyche's resistance to growth. He materializes in moments of vulnerability, when you have just begun to question the old patterns, when you are starting to feel the edges of your cage, when the possibility of authentic selfhood glimmers on the horizon like a distant shore. In these moments of tender awakening, he arrives with promises that sound like truth but carry the scent of spiritual opium. You don't need to do this inner work alone, he whispers. You don't need to face the darkness of your own depths. You don't need to learn to be complete in yourself. I am here now. I am the answer you have been seeking. I am the love that will make all your struggles unnecessary. But Jung knew better. He understood that what we call love is often the ego's desperate attempt to avoid the difficult journey of individuation. When we encounter someone who carries our projected, unconscious contents, we experience a kind of psychological inflation, a feeling of being more alive, more interesting, more complete than we have ever been. We mistake this inflation for love, this projection for recognition, this fantasy for relationship. The shadow lover specializes in this kind of enchantment. He appears not as he truly is, whatever that might be, but as the carrier of everything you have not yet developed in yourself. If you have not claimed your own creative power, he arrives as the tortured artist. If you have not embodied your own freedom, he appears as the untamable rebel. If you have not integrated your own depth and mystery, he manifests as the profound and enigmatic soul who understands things that others cannot grasp. This is why he feels so compelling, so necessary, so unlike anyone you have ever met. He is not unlike anyone you have ever met. He is unlike anyone you have ever been. He carries the energy of your own unlived life, and in his presence, you feel the stirring of capacities you didn't know you possessed. But here is the seductive trap. Instead of recognizing these capacities as your own and beginning the work of developing them within yourself, you believe they exist only in him, that you can access them only through relationship with him. The addiction begins immediately, not to him as a person, but to the version of yourself that seems to exist only in his presence, in his company, or even just in the fantasy of his company. You feel more alive, more creative, more mysterious, more powerful than you have ever felt before. You begin to organize your life around maintaining this feeling, around staying connected to this projected source of your own vitality. This is how the shadow lover becomes a drug. The high is real. You are indeed accessing parts of yourself that have been dormant, but you are accessing them through dependency rather than development, through projection rather than integration. Like any addiction, it requires increasing doses to maintain the same effect. The shadow lover must become more elusive, more mysterious, more impossible to pin down in order to continue generating the psychological tension that keeps you feeling alive. And so he does. The shadow lover is a master of the art of intermittent reinforcement, offering just enough connection to keep you hooked, just enough withdrawal to keep you yearning, just enough promise to prevent you from giving up, just enough disappointment to ensure that you never quite relax into satisfaction. He understands intuitively that if he were fully available, fully present, fully committed to meeting you as you actually are, the projection would collapse and you would be left facing the terrible and wonderful truth that what you have been seeking in him has been living in you all along. The dance becomes a kind of spiritual masturbation, a closed loop of fantasy that generates intense sensation while leading nowhere but back to itself. You begin to live more in the realm of possibility than reality, more in the space of what might happen than what is actually happening. Your real life becomes a placeholder, something to endure between moments of contact with him, between texts or calls or glimpses or promises, or the exquisite agony of waiting for the next sign that this impossible love might actually be possible. Jung observed that we often fall in love with our own unlived potential, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the shadow lover dynamic. He becomes a repository for everything you have been afraid to become, everything you have been too small or too safe or too socialized to embody. Through him, you touch these forbidden aspects of yourself without having to take responsibility for actually developing them. Through him, you experience passion without commitment, creativity without discipline, freedom without consequence, depth without the hard work of excavating your own soul. But the soul cannot be fooled indefinitely. Somewhere in the depths of your being, the self knows that this is counterfeit intimacy, pseudo-relationship, an elaborate form of spiritual bypassing that allows you to feel the excitement of growth without actually growing. The restlessness that drove you toward him in the first place continues to stir because the shadow lover cannot actually satisfy the deep longing he appears to address. He can only provide a temporary distraction from it, a seductive detour that leads further away from the authentic meeting you are truly seeking. This is when the shadow lover reveals his true nature, not as a person who is disappointing you, but as a projection that is beginning to dissolve under the pressure of reality. The more you try to make him real, the more elusive he becomes. The more you try to nail down the relationship, the more it transforms into something else entirely. The more you try to capture the magic you felt in the beginning, the more it slips through your fingers like water. You begin to notice the patterns, how he appears most intensely when you are starting to focus on your own growth, your own interests, your own life, how he disappears when you most need consistency and presence, how the conversations that once felt so profound now seem to circle around the same themes without ever landing anywhere solid, how the person you thought you knew seems to change shape depending on your angle of approach, like a figure made of smoke that looks solid from a distance but dissolves when you try to touch it. The cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. The gap between the person you experience in fantasy and the person who shows up in reality grows too wide to bridge with imagination. The future you have been building in your mind, the relationship that always seems just about to begin, the connection that is always on the verge of deepening, the love that is always promising to transform from potential into actuality, begins to reveal itself as a mirage that recedes every time you move toward it. This is the moment of reckoning with the shadow lover, not the dramatic ending you might expect, but something more subtle and more devastating. The gradual recognition that there was never a real relationship to end. There was only your relationship with your own projection, your own unlived life, your own unwillingness to meet the parts of yourself that you had been seeking in him. The withdrawal from this realization is profound, not just the loss of him, but the loss of the version of yourself that seemed to exist only in relationship to him. Without the drug of projection, you, are left facing the raw reality of your own unexamined life, your own undeveloped potential, your own responsibility for becoming the person you have been seeking in others. This withdrawal is not punishment, it is initiation. Jung understood that the collapse of projections, while painful, is also liberating. It returns to you the energy you have been investing in phantoms. It reveals the capacities you have been attributing to others as your own unlived potential. It shows you that what you have been seeking in the shadow lover has been waiting patiently in the depths of your own being, not as a projection to be cast onto another, but as an aspect of yourself to be developed and integrated. The shadow lover was never the answer to your longing. He was a symptom of it. He appeared because you had not yet learned to have a relationship with the unknown, mysterious, creative aspects of yourself. He seemed necessary because you had not yet discovered that you are already complete, already whole, already containing within yourself everything you have been seeking in others. But recognizing this intellectually and embodying it experientially are two different things entirely. The addiction to the shadow lover runs deep because it serves multiple functions in the psyche that is not ready for the full responsibility of selfhood. It provides excitement without commitment, intensity without intimacy, the feeling of aliveness without the vulnerability of actually being seen and known by another person. Most importantly, it allows you to avoid the fundamental terror that underlies all projection, the fear that if you show up as you actually are, without enhancement or performance or the reflected glory of association with someone else's power, you might not be enough. The shadow lover allows you to experience a heightened version of yourself without having to risk discovering whether your ordinary self is lovable. This fear is the golden thread that leads back to the gilded cage. The shadow lover is not separate from the borrowed dreams. He is their most seductive expression. He represents the ultimate borrowed dream, the fantasy that someone else holds the key to your own completeness, that love is something that happens to you rather than something that flows from you, that your most authentic self can only emerge in relationship to another rather than in relationship to yourself. Breaking free from the shadow lover's seduction requires recognizing that he is not a person, but a pattern, not a relationship, but a form of spiritual materialism that keeps you focused on external acquisition rather than internal development. It requires understanding that the excitement you feel in his presence is actually the excitement of touching your own unlived potential, and that you can access this potential directly through the patient, unglamorous work of developing a relationship with yourself. This recognition is the beginning of the great withdrawal, not a bitter retreat from love, but a sacred turning toward the only love that can actually transform you. The love that arises from wholeness rather than need, from presence rather than projection, from the courage to meet yourself completely before attempting to meet another. The shadow lover's seduction loses its power the moment you recognize that what you have been seeking in him has been living in you all along, waiting not for the right person to arrive, but for you to turn toward it with the same intensity, attention, and devotion you have been lavishing on phantoms. This turning is the beginning of the journey home to yourself, the only journey that leads to the kind of love that can actually satisfy the soul's deepest longing. There comes a moment in every woman's journey when the noise of the world becomes unbearable, when the marketplace of hearts reveals itself as a bazaar of illusions, when the very air seems thick with the desperate projections of souls who have forgotten how to be alone with themselves. This is the moment of the great withdrawal, not a retreat born of defeat, but an advance toward a more authentic way of being, not an escape from love, but a pilgrimage toward the only love that can truly transform, the love that begins with befriending yourself. Jung understood this withdrawal as essential to the process of individuation. He saw how the soul, in order to discover its own authentic nature, must first learn to exist independently of the collective's expectations, demands, and definitions. Like the ancient mystics who retreated to desert caves not from hatred of the world, but from love of truth, you are being called toward a sacred hermitage, a space of solitude where the deepest conversations are not with others, but with the vast, unexplored territory of your own being. This call does not arrive as a gentle suggestion. It comes as an imperative that can no longer be ignored, a force that pulls you away from the familiar patterns of seeking completion in others with the irresistible power of a tide turning. The shadow lovers lose their hold. The borrowed dreams crumble into dust. The gilded cage reveals itself as a prison of your own making, its golden bars dissolving the moment you stop believing in their necessity. The withdrawal begins with a recognition that is both simple and revolutionary. You are complete, not potentially complete, not complete if you find the right person or achieve the right relationship status, but complete right now in this moment as you are. This recognition does not come as an intellectual understanding, but as a cellular knowing, a remembering that happens in the body, in the bones, in the very marrow of your being. But completeness, you discover, is not the same as finished. You are whole and also becoming, complete and also evolving. The hermitage is not a destination but a laboratory, not an ending but a beginning, not a withdrawal from life but an immersion into the deepest life possible. The life that unfolds when you are no longer performing for an audience, no longer seeking approval, no longer organizing your existence around the possibility of being loved by someone else. In this sacred solitude, strange things begin to happen. The silence that you once feared, the silence that drove you toward shadow lovers and borrowed dreams, reveals itself as incredibly full of your own thoughts, finally given space to breathe, full of your own creativity, no longer channeled toward making yourself attractive to others, full of your own wisdom, which had been drowned out by the cacophony of external voices telling you who you should be and what you should want. The hermit archetype awakens within you, carrying the lantern of self-knowledge into territories of your being that have never been explored. This is not the bitter hermit of fairy tales, the one who withdraws from the world in anger and disappointment. This is the sacred hermit, the one who understands that solitude is not the absence of love, but love's purest form. Love without object, love without agenda, love as a state of being rather than a transaction or negotiation. Jung spoke of the hermit as one who has learned to be in relationship with the self, that deeper, transpersonal aspect of the psyche that contains both the personal and the universal, both the individual and the archetypal. In the sacred hermitage, you begin to discover that you are not just the small self that has been seeking love in the marketplace, but also a vast being capable of containing multitudes, of being your own companion, your own lover, your own deepest friend. This discovery is initially disorienting. You have been conditioned to believe that solitude is loneliness, that being alone means being unloved, that a woman without a relationship is somehow incomplete or failed. The collective unconscious carries powerful messages about the necessity of pairing, the tragedy of the single woman, the incompleteness of a life lived without romantic partnership. These messages have been so deeply internalized that choosing solitude initially feels like choosing death. But death is exactly what is required. Not literal death, but the symbolic death that Jung understood as essential to rebirth. The death of the version of yourself that could only exist in relationship to others. The death of the identity that was built on being wanted, needed, desired by someone else. The death of the story that your worth is determined by your ability to attract and maintain love from external sources. This death is not passive, but active, not something that happens to you, but something you choose, not a surrender to defeat, but a sacrifice offered in service of a greater becoming. Like the mythical phoenix, you must be willing to burn up everything you have been in order to discover who you truly are beneath the accumulated layers of conditioning, performance, and projection. The hermitage becomes the sacred space where this burning happens, away from the mirrors of other people's expectations, away from the constant feedback loop of social validation, away from the distraction of trying to be attractive or impressive or lovable to anyone but yourself. You begin to encounter the raw material of your authentic being. This material is not always beautiful in the conventional sense. It includes your shadows, your edges, your unprocessed grief, your unlived dreams, your secret shames, your hidden brilliance. In the marketplace of hearts, these aspects of yourself were either performed as attractive qualities or hidden as unacceptable flaws. In the sacred hermitage, they simply are. There is no audience to perform for, no one to impress, no one whose approval you need to maintain. There is only you facing yourself with the same patience and curiosity you might bring to studying a fascinating stranger who has just moved into your neighborhood. This self-meeting is the beginning of authentic self-love, not the narcissistic self-obsession that seeks to make itself attractive to others, but the genuine appreciation that arises from truly knowing and accepting yourself. You begin to discover that you are interesting company, that your own thoughts and feelings and creative impulses are worth exploring, that the conversation you can have with yourself is richer and more nourishing than many of the conversations you have been having with others. The hermitage teaches you the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the feeling of being disconnected from yourself while surrounded by others. Solitude is the feeling of being deeply connected to yourself while physically alone. In the sacred hermitage, you discover that solitude is not empty but full, not sad but peaceful, not a consolation prize but a choice made from abundance rather than scarcity. This abundance is not something you create, it is something you discover. It has been there all along, buried beneath the layers of seeking and performing and projecting. It is the abundance of your own being, the richness of your own inner landscape, the treasure that Jung called the self, that aspect of you that is connected to something larger than your personal story, something that has been whole and complete from the very beginning. In the hermitage, you begin to understand that romantic love, as beautiful as it can be, is not the pinnacle of human experience. It is one note in a vast symphony that includes creative expression, spiritual connection, friendship, service, solitude, beauty, truth, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with your authentic nature. You begin to see how the obsession with romantic love has impoverished your relationship to all these other forms of fulfillment. The withdrawal from the marketplace of hearts allows space for these other loves to flourish. You fall in love with your morning coffee ritual, with the way light falls through your window at a certain time of day, with books that speak to your soul, with creative projects that emerge from your depths rather than from the need to impress anyone. You fall in love with your own thoughts, your own company, your own rhythm of living when it is not synchronized to anyone else's needs or expectations. This falling in love with your own life is not selfishness. It is the foundation of all authentic relationship. Jung understood that we can only give to others what we have first given to ourselves. If you have not learned to be present to your own experience, you cannot be truly present to another. If you have not learned to appreciate your own company, you will seek relationships from need rather than choice. If you have not discovered your own completeness, You will inevitably make others responsible for your wholeness. The sacred hermitage is where this foundation is built. Not quickly, not easily, but with the patience of someone planting a garden that will not bloom for several seasons. In solitude, you learn to sit with your own discomfort without immediately seeking someone else to soothe it. You learn to celebrate your own victories without needing external validation to make them real. You learn to hold your own pain with the same tenderness you would offer a beloved friend. This learning is not linear. The hermitage is not a place you go once and then leave, transformed and complete. It is a space you return to again and again throughout your life, whenever you notice that you have begun to lose yourself in the noise of the world, whenever you realize that you have started performing again instead of simply being, whenever you feel the old familiar pull toward seeking completion in others. The hermit learns to recognize the signs, the subtle shift from choosing solitude to feeling lonely in it, the gradual return of the belief that something is missing, the slow creep of the old stories about needing someone else to make life complete. When these signs appear, the hermit knows it is time to deepen the withdrawal, to return more fully to the sacred hermitage, to remember once again who she is when no one is watching. This is the rhythm of authentic individuation, not a straight line toward some final destination, but a spiral dance between solitude and connection, between being alone and being with others, between the sacred hermitage and the world. The difference is that after you have learned to be complete in your own company, your connections with others arise from choice rather than need, from abundance rather than scarcity, from wholeness rather than the desire to be completed. The lantern that the hermit carries is the light of self-knowledge, but it is also something more. It is the light that allows you to see others clearly, without the distortion of projection or the fog of fantasy. When you are no longer seeking completion in others, you can see them as they actually are rather than as carriers of your unlived potential. When you are no longer performing for love, you can recognize when others are being authentic with you rather than performing for your approval. This clarity transforms everything. The shadow lovers lose their hypnotic power because you are no longer unconscious of your own depths. You are exploring them directly in the sacred hermitage. The borrowed dreams lose their appeal because you are discovering your own dreams in the fertile silence of solitude. The gilded cage becomes invisible because you are no longer seeking external validation to feel whole. But perhaps most importantly, the hermitage teaches you that love, real love, authentic love, love that nourishes rather than depletes, is not something you find but something you become. In the sacred solitude, you discover that you are not half a person seeking your other half, but a whole being capable of sharing your wholeness. You are not empty seeking to be filled, but full seeking to overflow. You are not broken seeking to be fixed, but complete seeking to express your completeness in relationship with other complete beings. This understanding changes the very ground of relationship. Instead of two half-people clinging to each other for completion, love becomes the meeting of two whole people who choose to create something together that neither could create alone. Instead of need disguised as love, it becomes recognition, the deep seeing of one complete being by another, complete being, the celebration of wholeness, meeting wholeness. But this kind of love can only be found by someone who has first learned to love herself completely. Shadows and light, beauty and brokenness, strength and vulnerability. It can only be chosen by someone who knows that she is already whole, already complete, already enough exactly as she is. It can only be sustained by someone who continues to return to the sacred hermitage, continues to tend the flame of self-knowledge, continues to choose her own company as worth keeping. The great withdrawal is not the end of love. It is the beginning of love that is worthy of the name. It is not the rejection of relationship, but the preparation for relationship that can actually hold the fullness of two authentic beings meeting in truth rather than fantasy, in presence rather than projection, in the celebration of completeness rather than the desperate attempt to fill an inner void. In the sacred hermitage, you discover that the love you have been seeking has been there all along, not as something to be found in another, but as something to be awakened within yourself. Not as a feeling that requires an object, but as a way of being that is its own reward. Not as something you do, but as something you are, whole, complete, radiant with the light of your own authentic being, carrying the lantern of self-knowledge into whatever terrain the journey of your life reveals. This is the gift of the hermit, not the bitter wisdom of someone who has given up on love, but the radiant understanding of someone who has found its source, not the sad retreat of someone who could not make relationship work, but the sacred advance of someone who has learned that the most important relationship is the one you have with yourself. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of a story worth telling. The story of a woman who learned to love herself so completely that her very being became an invitation for others to discover their own wholeness, their own completeness, their own capacity to love from abundance rather than need. The sacred hermitage is always available. The lantern is always lit. The journey inward is always ready to begin again, deeper this time, more complete, more willing to discover what treasures await in the vast, unexplored territory of a soul that has finally come home to itself. In the deep hours when silence becomes a living thing, when the absence of voices creates a space so vast it seems to breathe with its own rhythm, she finds herself standing at the threshold of the negrado, that sacred blackening that the ancient alchemists knew as the first death, the necessary dissolution before any true gold could emerge from the crucible of the soul. This is not the loneliness that comes from being left behind, not the hollow ache of the abandoned child crying in the night. This is something far more mysterious, far more dangerous to the ego's carefully constructed fortifications. This is the loneliness of the one who has glimpsed the authentic path and chosen it over the well-worn roads of conventional connection, the loneliness of the seeker who has turned away from the comfortable slavery of emotional dependency toward the terrifying freedom of her own becoming. In this darkness, all her previous understandings of love begin their slow dissolution. The romantic fantasies that once sustained her, the belief that somewhere out there exists another soul whose very presence would complete the puzzle of her being, these comforting illusions start to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The relationships she once pursued with such desperate hunger now reveal themselves as elaborate dances of avoidance, intricate choreographies designed to keep her from facing the one relationship she has always feared most, the relationship with herself. Jung understood that the negrado is not punishment but preparation, not abandonment but invitation. In the alchemical tradition, this blackening phase represents the return to prima materia, to the original substance from which all creation emerges. She must become undone so that she can become remade. She must allow the familiar structures of her emotional life to dissolve so that something unprecedented can be born from the fertile darkness of her own depths. The silence that surrounds her now is pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of unborn selves waiting to emerge from the womb of her solitude. But first, she must endure the death of who she thought she was, the woman who defined herself through others' eyes, who measured her worth by the warmth of external affection, who believed that love was something that happened to her rather than something that flowed from her. This woman must die. In the stillness of her chosen isolation, she begins to hear sounds that were always there but drowned out by the constant noise of seeking, pleasing, adjusting, accommodating. She hears the rhythm of her own heart, not racing toward another's embrace, but beating its own ancient drum. She hears the whisper of thoughts that belong entirely to her, unmarked by the need to translate them for another's understanding or approval. This is the terrible gift of the negrado, the stripping away of all borrowed identities, all projected meanings, all external validations that have served as scaffolding for a self not yet strong enough to stand alone. In this dissolution, she encounters the raw material of her own being, unpolished and unadorned, without the comfortable masks of the persona or the familiar strategies of the ego. The darkness deepens, and with it comes a peculiar kind of intimacy, not with another person, but with the vast interior landscape she has spent years avoiding. Jung spoke of the unconscious as an ocean of untapped potential, and now she finds herself floating in these mysterious waters, no longer able to touch the familiar shores of her old self-understanding. Here, in the belly of this chosen solitude, she confronts the shadow of her romantic longings, not the beautiful, socially acceptable desire for partnership and companionship, but the raw, primitive hunger for another to complete her, to save her from the responsibility of her own wholeness. She sees now how she has used relationships as drugs, as escapes from the fundamental aloneness that Jung recognized as the starting point of all authentic individuation. The pain of this recognition is unlike any she has known. It is not the sharp, dramatic agony of betrayal or loss, but the slow, inexorable ache of truth, penetrating layers of self-deception that have been decades in the making. She realizes that she has never truly been alone before. Not really. Even in the physical absence of others, she has carried their voices, their expectations, their imagined judgments as constant companions. Her thoughts have been conversations. Her dreams have been performances. Her very sense of self has been a collaborative fiction written with others' unconscious participation. But now, in this negrado, these phantom voices begin to fade. The internal chorus of parents, lovers, friends, society, all the external authorities to whom she has unconsciously surrendered her sovereign right to define her own reality. These voices grow dim in the expanding silence of her authentic solitude. What emerges in their absence is both terrifying and sacred. The sound of her own voice, speaking truths she has never dared to acknowledge, even to herself. The alchemists knew that the negrado often appears as a kind of madness, a dissolution of familiar categories and comfortable certainties. She feels this dissolution now, not as breakdown but as breakthrough, the necessary chaos that precedes new order, the sacred confusion that Jung recognized as the soul's way of making space for transformation that the rational mind could never orchestrate. In this darkness, she begins to understand that her lifelong hunger for love has been, at its deepest level, a hunger for her own completion. But completion, she realizes now, is not about finding someone to fill her empty spaces. It is about discovering that these spaces were never empty at all, only unexplored. The void she has tried to fill with others' presence is revealed to be not absence, but presence in its most concentrated form. Not emptiness, but fullness beyond the ego's capacity to recognize. The nights stretch long now, unmarked by the familiar rhythms of connection and disconnection that once gave her life its shape. Sleep comes differently. Dreams emerge from deeper waters. She finds herself in conversation with figures she does not recognize, wise women, ancient grandmothers, priestesses of forgotten traditions, who speak to her in languages older than words. These dream conversations feel more real, more nourishing than most of the exchanges she has had in waking life. Jung taught that in the negrado, the soul becomes like black earth, fertile with potential but unformed, undefined. She feels this fertility now, this sense of being pregnant with possibilities she cannot yet name. The desperation that once drove her toward others begins to transform into something else, not the sharp urgency of need, but the patient, purposeful energy of creative incubation. The alchemy of this darkness works its changes slowly, mysteriously, where once she experienced her aloneness as evidence of some fundamental inadequacy, some failure to be lovable enough to keep another close, she now begins to sense it as a kind of appointment with destiny. The solitude that once felt like punishment reveals itself as pilgrimage. The loneliness that seemed like exile shows itself to be homecoming. This is the paradox that Jung understood so deeply, that only in embracing our aloneness completely do we become capable of true communion. Only in releasing our desperate grip on others do we become worthy of genuine love. Only in ceasing to seek ourselves in external mirrors do we develop the clear vision necessary to see others as they truly are, rather than as projections of our own need. In the negrado, she learns to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between abandonment and chosen retreat, between the ego's fear of isolation and the soul's longing for authentic encounter with itself. The transformation is subtle but profound, like learning to breathe underwater, like developing new senses adapted to an environment she never knew existed. The tears that come now are different from any she has shed before. They are not the tears of self-pity or frustrated desire, but the tears of recognition, the salt water of the soul acknowledging its own vast capacity for love, a capacity that has been narrowed and distorted by years of believing that love was scarce, that it existed only in limited supply, that it could only be obtained through complex negotiations with others' willingness to provide it. Jung spoke of the negrado as a return to the womb, a regression in service of progression. She feels this return now not to childish dependency, but to the fertile darkness from which new life emerges. In choosing this solitude, she has chosen to gestate herself, to become both mother and child in the mysterious process of her own rebirth. The world outside continues its familiar rhythms, people falling in love, breaking apart, seeking each other with the same desperate hunger she once knew so well. But she has stepped outside this dance, not in judgment or superiority, but in recognition that for her, right now, the most radical act of love is to love herself deeply enough to face her own company without distraction, to meet her own gaze without flinching, to hear her own voice without the need for another's harmony. This negrado teaches her that the deepest loneliness is not the absence of others, but the absence of authentic relationship with oneself. And paradoxically, it is only through embracing this ultimate loneliness that she can begin to discover what it might mean to love without possession, without project, without the unconscious agenda of completion that has poisoned every relationship she has ever attempted. In the silence, she begins to sense something moving, not toward her, but within her. Something ancient and patient is awakening, stirring in the depths of her being, like a dragon uncurling from centuries of sleep. This is not the masculine she has sought in others, not the animus projected onto external figures, but her own inner masculine beginning to reveal itself. Creative, assertive, visionary, complete. The negrado is teaching her to trust this inner movement, to honor the slow emergence of her own wholeness without rushing toward the light, without cutting short the necessary darkness. Jung knew that premature illumination could blind the soul. That authentic transformation requires the full journey through the underworld of the unconscious. through the compost of dissolved ego structures, through the rich darkness where new life takes root. She is learning to love the blackness itself, to find in this void not the absence of love, but its most concentrated essence. The negrado reveals that what she has been calling loneliness is actually solitude's gift, the space necessary for the soul to remember its own nature, to reconnect with its own source, to prepare for a kind of love so different from what she has known that it will require an entirely transformed capacity to receive and express it. Night after night, she sits with this dissolution, watching familiar aspects of herself melt away like snow in spring. The woman who measured her worth by her desirability, who shaped her thoughts to please others' ears, who modified her dreams to fit others' expectations. This woman dissolves into the primordial waters of the unconscious, becoming raw material for a new creation, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she begins to understand that this is not an ending but a beginning, not a loss but a finding, not a death but the deepest possible preparation for the life she has never dared to live. The negrado is not teaching her to be alone, it is teaching her to be whole. And wholeness, she is discovering, is the only foundation upon which authentic love can ever be built. In the expanding darkness of her solitude, she finally hears it clearly, the voice that has been speaking her name since before she was born, the voice that knows her true nature and calls her home to herself. This voice does not seek to complete her or be completed by her. It speaks from the place of her own completion, inviting her to remember what she has always been, but has forgotten in the hypnotic trance of seeking herself in others' eyes. The negrado continues its sacred work, and she learns to trust its wisdom, to surrender to its timing, to allow herself to be unmade so thoroughly that when she is remade, she will be someone capable of love beyond anything she has previously imagined. The darkness holds her like a cosmic womb, and she finally understands that this is not isolation, this is incubation. She is not being abandoned by love, she is being prepared for it. In the sanctum of her solitude, where the old hungers have been burned away in the negrado's sacred fire, something extraordinary begins to stir. It is subtle at first, like the barely perceptible shift in light that announces dawn while the world still dreams in darkness. She feels it as a presence, not external, not arriving from beyond the boundaries of her being, but emerging from depths within herself that she never knew existed. This is the animus awakening, not the projected masculine she has sought in countless others, not the missing piece she believed could only be provided by external love, but her own inner masculine rising like a sun from the ocean of her unconscious. Jung understood this archetypal energy as one of the great discoveries available to the feminine psyche, the recognition that what she has been seeking in the outer world has been dwelling within her all along, waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. The first sign of this awakening comes as a new quality in her thoughts. Where once her mental landscape was dominated by questions seeking answers from others, what does he think? How do I appear? What should I do to be loved? Now she finds herself thinking thoughts that arise from their own authority, ideas that carry their own weight, and need no external validation to feel true. These thoughts have a different texture, a different temperature. They are warm with their own fire rather than dependent on others' light for illumination. She begins to notice that when she sits in silence, her mind no longer immediately reaches toward absent others, like a plant leaning desperately toward the sun. Instead, there is a gathering inward, a consolidation of energy that feels like coming home to a house she didn't know she owned. This inward turning is not narcissistic or self-absorbed. It is the soul recognizing its own completeness, its own capacity to generate the very qualities she once believed could only be received from another. The animus speaks to her first in dreams, appearing as figures of strength and vision, sometimes as a wise teacher, sometimes as a creative artist, sometimes as a warrior who knows the difference between healthy assertion and destructive aggression. These dream figures do not court her or seek to possess her. They invite her into collaboration, into co-creation, into a kind of sacred partnership that transcends the ordinary dynamics of romantic pursuit and surrender. Jung taught that the animus carries the gift of logos, the principle of meaning, structure, and creative order. As this inner masculine begins to emerge from the unconscious depths, she finds herself capable of new kinds of thinking, new ways of engaging with the world that do not depend on emotional fusion with others. She discovers within herself a capacity for clarity that cuts through confusion, for vision that sees beyond immediate circumstances, for strength that does not need to prove itself through dominance or submission. This is not the brittle independence of the wounded ego, not the defensive self-sufficiency born from disappointment and betrayal. This is something far more profound, the recognition that she contains within herself both the feminine principle of receptive wisdom and the masculine principle of creative action, both the yin of deep knowing and the yang of purposeful manifestation. The inner wedding begins as she learns to honor both aspects of her nature, to let them dance together in the sacred marriage that Jung called the conjunctio. The process is mysterious, often occurring beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. She might find herself writing with a boldness that surprises her, expressing ideas that seem to come from a source deeper than her ordinary personality. Or she might discover herself making decisions with a clarity and conviction that feels entirely new, as if some inner council of wisdom has been convened and unanimous verdicts are being reached without the usual torment of indecision. In her solitude, she begins to court this inner masculine with the same attention she once lavished on external relationships. She learns to listen for its voice, to trust its guidance, to receive its gifts, without the fear that accepting strength somehow diminishes her femininity. This courtship is unlike any she has ever experienced. There is no game playing, no strategy, no need to present herself as anything other than exactly what she is. The animus loves her for her authenticity, not her performance. She discovers that this inner masculine has been speaking to her throughout her life, but its voice was drowned out by the louder demands of the ego's search for external validation. Now, in the quiet space created by her withdrawal from the exhausting cycles of pursuit and disappointment, she can finally hear its subtle communications. It speaks through sudden insights that arrive like gifts, through creative impulses that feel both personal and transpersonal, through moments of clarity that cut through years of confusion with surgical precision. The animus teaches her about healthy aggression, not the desperate clinging or manipulative anger that arises from fear of abandonment, but the clean energy of knowing what she wants and moving toward it without apology. She learns to say no without elaborate explanations, to say yes without seeking permission, to express preferences that arise from her own authentic desires rather than from calculations about what others might find acceptable. This inner masculine also carries the gift of discrimination, the ability to see clearly, to make distinctions, to choose consciously rather than react unconsciously. Under its influence, she begins to see her past relationships with new eyes, recognizing patterns she had been blind to before. She sees how she gave her power away, not out of love, but out of fear, how she accepted far less than she deserved, not from generosity, but from a deep, unconscious belief that she was not worthy of authentic reciprocity. The animus brings with it a quality of vision that transcends the immediate and emotional, where her feminine wisdom excels at depth, receptivity, and cyclical understanding. This inner masculine offers linear focus, goal-directed energy, and the capacity to build structures that can support her emerging authenticity. She finds herself setting boundaries not from a place of defense, but from clear recognition of what serves her becoming and what does not. As this integration deepens, she experiences moments of profound self-sufficiency that have nothing to do with isolation and everything to do with wholeness. She realizes that the completion she once sought through merger with another is actually available through the conscious marriage of her own inner opposites. The animus does not fill her emptiness. It reveals that she was never empty to begin with. Jung understood that the animus, when properly related to, becomes a bridge to the self, that larger pattern of wholeness that transcends the personal ego. Through her relationship with this inner masculine, she begins to access forms of knowing that are both deeply personal and mysteriously transpersonal. She finds herself connected to streams of creativity and wisdom that seem to flow from a source larger than her individual psychology, yet accessible only through the specific doorway of her own authentic being. The inner wedding is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of recognition and integration. Each day brings new opportunities to honor both aspects of her nature, to let the feminine and masculine within her inform and enrich each other rather than compete for dominance. She learns to receive the animus's gifts of clarity and direction, while offering in return the feminine gifts of intuition and deep feeling. This integration manifests in practical ways that surprise her. She finds herself more capable of creative expression, as if the inner masculine provides the structure and focus necessary to give form to the feminine's flowing inspiration. Projects that once seemed overwhelming now feel manageable because she can access both the visionary energy that conceives and the practical energy that executes. Her relationship with her own sexuality begins to transform as well. Where once she experienced her erotic nature as something that needed to be awakened by another, she now discovers it as an internal dialogue between these archetypal energies within herself. The animus teaches her that desire is not dependency but creative force, not need but expression of her own vital power, seeking outlets for manifestation. She learns to make love to her own life, with the passion she once reserved for others, to court her own dreams with the devotion she once offered to external relationships. The animus shows her that romance is not something that happens between two people, but a quality of engagement with existence itself, a way of approaching life with reverence, curiosity, and the recognition that every moment offers an opportunity for deeper intimacy with the mystery of being. In her solitude, she practices this new way of loving. She brings flowers to her own altar, writes poetry to her own soul, creates beauty not to impress others, but as offerings to the sacred principle of life itself that flows through her. These acts of self-courtship are not narcissistic but deeply generous. Each act of authentic self-love increases her capacity to love others freely, without the hidden agenda of completion or the unconscious expectation of return. The animus teaches her about loyalty, not the desperate clinging to relationships that no longer serve, but faithfulness to her own process of becoming. She learns to trust the intelligence of her own growth, to follow the inner guidance that emerges from the marriage of her feminine intuition and masculine clarity. This trust allows her to move through the world with a new kind of confidence, not the brittle bravado of the defended ego, but the quiet assurance of one who knows herself to be both source and recipient of the love she seeks. As this inner integration deepens, she begins to understand why all her previous relationships failed to provide the fulfillment she sought. She was asking them to perform an impossible task, to provide what could only come from within, to complete a wholeness that could only be achieved through her own conscious work of integration. The men she loved were being asked to carry her animus projection, to embody qualities that belong to her own inner development. Now, liberated from this unconscious demand, she finds herself curious about what relationship might look like when neither person is seeking completion through the other. She imagines conversations that arise from overflow rather than need, touch that expresses celebration rather than desperation, presence that enhances rather than defines. These imaginings feel less like fantasies and more like memories of a future already written in the code of her own becoming. The animus reveals to her the difference between genuine strength and the compensatory aggression that arises from unacknowledged weakness. True masculine energy, she learns, does not need to dominate or control. It serves the larger pattern of wholeness, offering its gifts of clarity and direction in service of love rather than in pursuit of power. When this energy flows through her, she feels simultaneously more assertive and more yielding, more focused and more open. In the temple of her own solitude, she begins to practice the art of inner dialogue, conscious conversation between the different aspects of her psyche. She learns to ask her inner masculine for guidance when she needs clarity or direction, and to offer her feminine wisdom when he becomes too rigid or goal-oriented. This internal consultation becomes more reliable than any external advice she has ever received, because it arises from the unique circumstances of her own soul's journey. The integration of the animus brings with it a new relationship to time. Where once she was always rushing toward some imagined future fulfillment through relationship, she now finds herself capable of presence that is complete in itself. The inner masculine teaches her about purposeful action that is not driven by anxiety or inadequacy, while the inner feminine ensures that this purposefulness remains connected to the natural rhythms of her being. She realizes that what she once called chemistry in relationships was often simply the activation of her own projected animus, the excitement of seeing her own potential masculine qualities reflected back to her through another person. Now generating this energy internally, she no longer needs relationships to make her feel alive or complete. This does not make her less interested in connection, but infinitely more capable of it, because she approaches others from fullness rather than emptiness. The inner wedding transforms her understanding of commitment. Where once she believed commitment meant binding herself to another person, regardless of growth or change, she now understands it as faithfulness to the process of becoming, both her own and any partner she might choose to share this journey with. The animus teaches her that true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to let go, that genuine love sometimes demands the strength to disappoint others' expectations in service of deeper truth. As this archetypal integration continues its subtle work, she finds herself naturally developing qualities she once desperately sought in others. The strength she craved from masculine partners emerges as her own capacity to stand in truth, regardless of others' reactions. The vision she hoped they would provide reveals itself as her own ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to larger patterns and possibilities. The protection she sought through relationship manifests as her own fierce commitment to honoring what is sacred within her. Jung taught that the goal of individuation is not to eliminate the need for relationship, but to transform the quality of our relating. As her inner marriage deepens, she finds herself more capable of genuine intimacy, not less. But this intimacy is no longer based on need or fear. It springs from recognition, from the joy of meeting another whole person with her own wholeness, from the delight of communion between completed beings, rather than the desperate fusion of incomplete parts seeking to make a whole. The inner wedding is not a destination but a way of being, not an achievement but an ongoing practice of honoring the full spectrum of her own nature. Each day offers new opportunities to deepen this relationship with herself, to let the inner masculine and feminine inform each other more completely, to embody more fully the wholeness that Jung recognized as every human being's birthright and responsibility. In the sanctuary of her solitude, she has discovered that she is not half a person seeking her other half, but a complete cosmos learning to know and express itself fully. The animus has shown her that she contains within herself all the love she has ever sought, all the strength she has ever needed, all the vision she has ever craved. This is not the end of her capacity for relationship, but the beginning of a completely new way of loving, from wholeness rather than need, from choice rather than compulsion, from the overflowing abundance of a soul that has finally learned to recognize its own completeness. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the external world grows quiet enough for the inner voice to be heard. Not the voice that has been trained to speak in acceptable cadences, not the voice that knows how to modulate its truth, to fit the expectations of others, but the voice that has been waiting, patient as stone, persistent as water, for this precise moment of solitude to finally emerge from the depths where it has been hidden. She sits now in the silence that she has both craved and feared, the silence that exists beyond the reach of phones and notifications, beyond the gentle tyranny of other people's needs and opinions. This is not the comfortable quiet of a moment stolen between obligations, but the vast oceanic silence that stretches when one finally stops performing the elaborate dance of being who others need you to be. In this silence, something unprecedented begins to happen. The masks begin to slip. The mirror that appears in solitude is unlike any mirror she has ever encountered. It does not reflect the careful construction of features arranged to please, nor does it show the persona she has spent years perfecting, that masterful performance of the woman who has learned to be charming without being threatening, vulnerable without being burdensome, strong without being intimidating, soft without being weak. This mirror shows something far more dangerous and far more sacred. It shows her essence. Jung understood that the persona, that elaborate mask we wear to navigate the social world, becomes so familiar that we begin to mistake it for our true face. We forget that beneath the carefully constructed image lies a being of such authentic power that we have spent years learning to hide her, to dim her light, to make her small enough to fit into spaces that were never designed to contain her vastness. The mirror of solitude strips away this comfortable deception with the ruthless precision of truth. As she looks into this unfamiliar reflection, the first sensation is vertigo, the dizzying recognition that she has been living as a stranger to herself. The woman looking back at her is not the woman who has learned to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, who has mastered the art of being interested in conversations that bore her soul, who has become expert at making herself smaller in the presence of egos that require vast amounts of space. This woman looking back has eyes that have never learned to lie about what they want, a mouth that has never learned to swallow words that need to be spoken, hands that have never learned to applaud performances that insult her intelligence. The terror begins here, in this recognition. For if this is who she truly is, then what has she been doing all these years? What has she been offering to the world, to lovers, to friends, to the mirror each morning as she prepared her face to meet the faces that she met? The realization crashes over her like a wave that has traveled from the deepest part of the ocean. She has been living as an exile from her own life. But terror, Jung knew, is often the companion of the sacred. What terrifies us most is often what we most need to embrace, for it is in the spaces that frighten us that we discover the parts of ourselves that have been waiting to be reclaimed. The mirror of solitude does not show us our flaws. It shows us our power, and power, authentic power, is always terrifying to a psyche that has been trained to find safety in smallness. The false self that begins to shed in this mirror light is not shed easily. It has been years in the making, this careful construction of acceptability. Every thread of it has been woven with the desperate hope of belonging somewhere, of being chosen, of being found worthy of love. The girl who learned to be quiet when her opinions were inconvenient. The adolescent who learned to hide her intensity behind practiced casualness. The young woman who learned to make her dreams smaller so they wouldn't threaten anyone. All of these selves begin to dissolve in the mirror's unforgiving honesty. This dissolution is not comfortable. There is grief here, real and profound grief, for the years spent in service to a lie, for the authentic moments sacrificed on the altar of social acceptance, for all the time she said yes when her soul was screaming no, for all the time she dimmed her light so others could shine brighter. The mirror shows her not only who she is, but who she has refused to be, and the weight of this recognition is almost unbearable. Yet beneath the grief lies something else, something that begins as the faintest whisper and grows stronger with each moment of honest seeing. Relief. Relief so profound it feels like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in a foreign country where she never learned to speak the language fluently. Relief like taking off shoes that have never quite fit, like removing clothing that has always been too tight in places that matter. The relief of no longer having to remember which version of herself she is supposed to be in any given moment. The luminous being that emerges in this mirror space is not someone new. She is someone ancient, someone who has been waiting with infinite patience for this moment of recognition. She is the woman who was born knowing her own worth, before the world taught her to question it. She is the woman who once danced without wondering who was watching, who once spoke without calculating the effect of her words, who once loved without keeping score of what she received in return. Jung spoke of the self, not the ego self that navigates daily life, but the archetypal self that connects us to the deepest patterns of human existence, to the mystery that lies at the center of all becoming. This self does not care about social approval because it is connected to something far more vast than social structures. This self does not fear abandonment because it is connected to the source from which all life springs. This self does not need validation because it is validation. It is the part of us that validates existence itself. In the mirror of solitude, she begins to see this self looking back at her, and the recognition is like lightning illuminating a landscape she had forgotten existed. Here is the woman who knows what she wants without apologizing for wanting it. Here is the woman who can sit in her own company without fidgeting, without reaching for distractions, without the compulsive need to fill silence with chatter or activity. Here is the woman who understands that her value is not determined by how useful she is to others, how much she can give, how well she can anticipate and meet needs that were never her responsibility to meet. This confrontation with authentic selfhood demands something that feels impossible, that she love this woman exactly as she is, not as she might become with enough improvement, not as she appears when filtered through the soft light of others' approval, but as she exists in this moment, in all her complicated, imperfect, radiant humanity. The mirror asks her to love the woman she truly is, rather than the woman she thought she needed to become to deserve love from others. And here lies the revolutionary act that solitude demands, the recognition that she has been the one she has been waiting for all along. Not the improved version of herself that might someday be worthy of the love she craves, not the perfected self that has learned to eliminate all the inconvenient aspects of her personality, But this woman, right now, in all her messy, authentic complexity, the woman in the mirror has needs, real needs that have been denied and dismissed and negotiated away in the name of being easy to love. She has boundaries that have been violated so many times that she had begun to believe that having boundaries was selfish, that true love meant dissolving all limits, all sense of where she ended and others began. She has desires that have been judged as too much, too intense, too complicated for the simple love stories she was told were possible. The mirror shows her that these needs, these boundaries, these desires are not flaws to be corrected, but essential features of her authentic self. They are the geography of her soul, the landscape that must be honored if she is to live in truth rather than in the carefully constructed lie of who she thought she needed to be. In this recognition, something fundamental shifts. The question is no longer, how can I become someone worthy of love? But, how can I love this woman I am discovering myself to be? The mirror of solitude reveals that the love she has been seeking outside herself, the acceptance she has been trying to earn through performance and perfection, has been available all along, waiting for her to turn her attention inward with the same tenderness she has so freely given to others. This is not the easy self-love of affirmations and surface acceptance, but the fierce, complex love that sees clearly and loves anyway. The love that sees her patterns of self-betrayal and loves her enough to help her stop betraying herself. The love that sees her wounds and loves her enough to stop picking at them. The love that sees her power and loves her enough to stop hiding it under bushels of false humility. The mirror shows her that she has been both the prisoner and the jailer, both the seeker and the sought, both the lover and the beloved. The key to the prison has been in her hand all along, but she has been looking everywhere except at her own palm, convinced that freedom must come from outside, that love must be earned from others, that worth must be validated by external sources. In the profound quiet of solitude, she begins to understand what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the process by which we become who we truly are, not who others need us to be, not who we think we should be, but who we are in the deepest sense, connected to the archetypal patterns that give life meaning and purpose. This process cannot happen in the presence of others, for in relationship we inevitably fall into the familiar patterns of adaptation and accommodation that keep us safe but small. The woman emerging in this mirror space is both more vulnerable and more powerful than the carefully constructed persona she has been presenting to the world. She is more vulnerable because she no longer has the armor of performance to protect her from the genuine responses of others. She can no longer hide behind the safety of being who others want her to be. She must risk being seen as she truly is, with all the possibility of rejection that such visibility entails. But she is also more powerful because she is no longer fragmenting her energy in the service of maintaining multiple false selves for multiple audiences. All of her life force is now available to her, no longer scattered across the exhausting work of being many people to many others. She is whole in a way she has never been whole, integrated in a way that makes her presence itself a gift to the world. The mirror of solitude shows her something else, that the love she has been seeking from others is not actually what she thought it was. She has been seeking someone to love the carefully constructed version of herself that she thought was lovable, someone to validate the performance she has been giving. But what she truly yearns for is to be seen and loved in her authentic complexity, to be held in her wholeness, to be met by someone who can recognize the luminous being she is discovering herself to be. This recognition changes everything about how she approaches relationship, how she approaches life itself. She can no longer pretend to be smaller than she is to make others comfortable. She can no longer hide her intelligence, her intensity, her depth, her passion behind the veil of acceptable femininity. She can no longer make herself responsible for other people's emotional comfort at the expense of her own emotional truth. The I mirror asks her to consider a radical possibility. What if she is already complete? What if she does not need another person to fill the emptiness she has been carrying, because the emptiness was not actually emptiness, but space, space for her own vastness to expand into, space for her own complexity to be held, space for her own mystery to unfold? What if the love she has been seeking is not something to be received from others, but something to be recognized as her own essential nature? In the deepest part of the mirror's reflection, she sees something that takes her breath away. She sees that she is already loved, has always been loved, not by some external force that might withdraw its love if she fails to meet certain conditions, but by the very source of life itself, by the creative principle that brought her into existence, not as a mistake to be corrected, but as a unique expression of cosmic creativity. This love does not need to be earned because it is her birthright. It does not need to be maintained through performance because it is unconditional. It does not need to be proven because it simply is, the ground of her being, the foundation upon which everything else is built. She has been trying to earn from others what she already possesses, in infinite abundance, trying to receive from external sources what is flowing from the source within her. The false self that has been shedding throughout this encounter with the mirror finally falls away completely, like a chrysalis that has served its purpose and is no longer needed. What emerges is not a butterfly. That transformation metaphor is too simple for what is happening here, but a woman who has remembered herself, who has returned to herself, who has come home to herself after a long exile in the land of other people's expectations. She looks in the mirror now and sees someone she recognizes, someone she has always known but had forgotten in the noise of the world's demands. She sees someone worthy of her own attention, her own care, her own tenderness. She sees someone whose company she actually enjoys, whose thoughts interest her, whose dreams deserve to be pursued, whose needs deserve to be met, whose boundaries deserve to be respected, whose love deserves to be cherished. The mirror of solitude has shown her the most radical truth of all. She is the love she has been seeking, not in some narcissistic sense that requires no one else, not in some spiritual bypassing that denies the human need for connection, but in the sense that until she recognizes her own inherent worth, her own essential lovability, her own complete and perfect acceptability exactly as she is, she will continue to seek from others what only she can give to herself. This is the sacred paradox that the mirror reveals. Only when she stops needing love from others does she become capable of receiving it. Only when she stops performing for approval does she become authentically attractive. Only when she stops trying to earn her place in the world does she discover that she belongs to the world by virtue of existing in it. The woman who emerges from this encounter with the mirror of solitude is not the same woman who entered it. She has been irrevocably changed by the sight of her own true face, by the recognition of her own essential worth, by the experience of loving herself not as a project to be improved, but as a mystery to be celebrated. She carries within her now an unshakable foundation, a source of love and validation that cannot be taken away by others because it does not depend on others. She has faced the true self and discovered that what she feared would be too much is actually exactly enough. What she feared would be unlovable is actually the source of all lovability. What she feared would be rejected is actually what has been waiting to be recognized, honored, and welcomed home. The mirror of solitude reflects back to her the most profound truth. She is already whole, already complete, already perfect in her imperfection, already worthy of the love she has been seeking. The journey outward can now begin, not from emptiness seeking to be filled, but from fullness seeking to be shared, not from need seeking to be met, but from love seeking to be expressed, not from brokenness seeking to be healed, but from wholeness seeking to be celebrated. In the silence that follows this recognition, she understands that everything is different now, and yet nothing has changed except her willingness to see what was always there. The mirror of solitude has shown her what Jung knew, that the self we discover in the depths of our own being is both utterly personal and utterly universal, both completely individual and completely connected to the great web of existence. She has found herself, and in finding herself, she has found the key to genuine relationship with all of life. From the depths of her solitary journey, something ancient begins to stir. Not ancient in the way of old wounds or familiar patterns, but ancient in the way of primordial wisdom, the way of deep knowing that predates the personal history of this single lifetime. She feels it first as a trembling in her bones, a recognition that seems to rise from the cellular level of her being, as if every part of her body is remembering something her mind had forgotten. This is the awakening of the archetypal feminine, the eternal woman who lives beneath the layers of conditioning and culture, beneath the learned behaviors and adapted responses that have shaped her individual personality. Jung understood that within each of us lie patterns older than civilization, older than language, older than the specific circumstances of our personal lives. These are the archetypes, the fundamental organizing principles of human experience that connect us to the great web of meaning that spans across cultures and across time. The feminine archetype that begins to emerge in her solitude is not the diminished, domesticated version that the modern world has tried to teach her to inhabit. It is not the feminine that defines itself in relation to the masculine, that finds its value in service or sacrifice, that measures its worth by how well it can support others in achieving their dreams while setting aside its own. This feminine that awakens is primal, complete unto itself, powerful in ways that need no external validation. She feels it first as a deep knowing in her belly, a certainty that has nothing to do with rational thought and everything to do with the wisdom of the body that knows how to grow life, how to create form from formlessness, how to birth new realities through the sheer force of creative will. This is the feminine that is connected to the cycles of the earth, to the phases of the moon, to the eternal dance of creation and destruction that keeps the universe in motion. Jung recognized that the feminine principle is fundamentally about receptivity, not passive receptivity that simply accepts whatever is given, but active, conscious receptivity that knows how to receive the seeds of possibility and transform them into manifest reality. This is the receptivity of the fertile earth that does not just accept the seed, but transforms it, nourishes it, and brings forth from it something entirely new. This is the receptivity of the ocean that receives all rivers but is never overwhelmed, that holds all waters in its vastness while maintaining its own essential nature. As this archetypal energy awakens within her, she begins to understand something revolutionary about her own nature. She is not half of a whole, waiting to be completed by another. She is not a supporting character in someone else's story. She is not a problem to be solved or a need to be fulfilled. She is a complete creative force, a source of life and wisdom and power that flows from the same cosmic principle that creates galaxies and grows forests and moves the tides. The goddess archetype begins to emerge from the depths of her psyche, not the sanitized, safe version that has been domesticated by patriarchal religions, but the wild, autonomous goddess who needs no temple built by others because she is the temple. This goddess creates her own sacred space wherever she goes, sanctifies the ground she walks upon simply by walking upon it. She does not wait for permission to be holy. Holiness is her nature, her birthright, her essential identity. This awakening brings with it a fundamental shift in how she experiences her own desires. Where once her wanting felt like weakness, like need that made her vulnerable to those who might choose to meet it or withhold it, now her desire feels like a sacred force, a creative power that has the capacity to call new realities into being. Her longing is no longer something to be managed or minimized or offered up for others to satisfy, but something to be honored as a direct communication from the creative principle that lives at her core. The queen archetype rises within her, the sovereign feminine who rules her own domain, not through domination, but through the natural authority that comes from being fully aligned with her own truth. This queen does not need to be chosen by others to know her worth. She chooses herself. She does not need to be crowned by external forces. She crowns herself with the recognition of her own inherent nobility. She does not need subjects to rule over. She rules the vast kingdom of her own inner landscape with wisdom and compassion. This queenly aspect of the archetypal feminine understands boundaries not as walls built to keep others out, but as sacred parameters that define the territory of the self. A queen knows where her kingdom begins and ends, knows what belongs within her realm and what does not. She can be generous with her subjects and gracious with her neighbors, but she never confuses generosity with the dissolution of sovereignty. She gives from abundance, never from emptiness, and she gives what she chooses to give rather than what others demand. The awakening of archetypal feminine energy brings with it a profound reconnection to the cycles of her own nature, where the modern world has taught her to override her natural rhythms in service of constant productivity. The archetypal feminine knows the wisdom of seasons, the necessity of fallow periods, the creative power that comes from honoring the natural ebb and flow of energy and attention. She begins to feel the connection to the lunar feminine, the aspect of the archetypal woman that waxes and wanes like the moon, that knows how to be both visible and hidden, both full and empty, both growing and releasing. This lunar wisdom teaches her that she does not need to be the same person every day, that consistency is not the highest virtue, that she can honor the different aspects of herself that emerge in different phases of her own inner cycle. The wise woman archetype begins to speak from within her, the crone who has moved beyond the need for external validation into the deep knowing that comes from having lived fully in her own truth. This wise woman sees through the illusions that have kept her small, recognizes the games that others play to maintain their own sense of power, understands the difference between love and manipulation, between genuine connection and emotional vampirism. This wisdom is not bitter or cynical, though it may appear so to those who are still invested in maintaining comfortable illusions. It is the clear-sighted wisdom of someone who has learned to see reality without the filters of wishful thinking or desperate hope. The wise woman within her can love deeply without losing herself, can give generously without depleting herself, can hold space for others without abandoning herself. Jung understood that these archetypal energies are not metaphors or psychological constructs, but living forces that can be directly experienced when we create the conditions for their emergence. In the deep solitude of her journey, removed from the noise and demands of the world, these ancient patterns begin to awaken in her psyche like flowers that bloom only in specific conditions of soil and season and light. The wild woman archetype emerges from the depths, the untamed feminine that has never learned to be appropriate, never learned to make itself smaller for the comfort of others. never learned to dim its natural radiance to avoid overwhelming the delicate egos that cannot bear to be in the presence of authentic power. This wild woman knows her own worth, not because others have told her she is valuable, but because she can feel the life force moving through her, like electricity, like fire, like the irrepressible energy of spring breaking through frozen ground. This wildness is not reckless or destructive, though it may appear so to those who are invested in maintaining systems that require women to be tame. It is the wildness of nature itself, organized by its own deep intelligence, following laws that are older and more fundamental than human conventions, connected to the source of life that creates and destroys with equal wisdom. As these archetypal energies awaken within her, she begins to experience her own sexuality in an entirely new way. No longer is her erotic energy something to be traded for love or security, something to be given away in hopes of receiving care in return. Her sexuality becomes sacred power, creative force, the very energy that the universe uses to create new life, new forms, new possibilities. The sacred prostitute archetype, not the degraded version that patriarchal culture has created, but the original temple priestess who understood sexuality as divine communion, begins to stir within her consciousness. This archetype knows that her body is not a commodity to be bartered, but a temple to be honored, that her sexual energy is not something she owes to others, but something she can choose to share as a sacred gift, when the conditions are right, when the container is worthy of what she brings. This sacred understanding of her own erotic nature transforms everything about how she approaches intimate relationship. She can no longer pretend that physical intimacy is separate from emotional and spiritual intimacy, can no longer compartmentalize her sexuality from her wholeness. When she shares her body, she is sharing the temple of the goddess, and she begins to understand that not everyone is prepared for such sacred communion. The mother archetype awakens within her as well, but not the martyred, self-sacrificing mother that culture has taught her to admire. This is the great mother who creates from love, not from duty, who nourishes because nourishment flows naturally from her abundance, not because she has been convinced that her value lies in what she can give to others. This mother knows the difference between nurturing and enabling, between supporting growth and creating dependence. This maternal energy extends beyond biological motherhood to encompass the creative capacity to birth new realities, new ways of being, new expressions of her own authentic nature. She is pregnant with possibilities, gravid with dreams that are ready to be born into the world. She understands that she is always in a creative process, always gestating something new in the fertile darkness of her inner world. The archetypal feminine that awakens within her is also deeply connected to the mystery traditions, to the ancient knowledge of how to move between worlds, how to access the wisdom that lives in the spaces between ordinary consciousness. She begins to trust her intuition, not as some vague, unreliable feeling, but as a direct line to the intelligence that operates beneath the level of rational thought. This intuitive knowing is one of the most profound gifts of the awakened feminine, the ability to sense what is true before the mind can explain why it is true, to read the energetic reality of situations and relationships with the precision of an ancient oracle. She begins to trust what she knows in her body, what she feels in her bones, what whispers to her in the quiet spaces between thoughts. The archetypal feminine also carries within it the deep knowledge of cycles, the understanding that all of life moves in patterns of beginning, growing, flowering, fruiting, releasing, dying, and being reborn. This cyclical wisdom teaches her to honor the natural rhythms of her own existence, to stop trying to force constant growth and productivity, to recognize that periods of apparent emptiness are actually periods of germination, when new possibilities are taking root in the darkness. As these archetypal energies fully awaken within her, she begins to experience herself as part of an unbroken lineage of women who have carried this wisdom through time. She feels connected to the ancient priestesses who understood the sacred nature of feminine power, to the wise women who preserved the old knowledge through dark ages of suppression, to the mystics and healers and creators who refused to be diminished by cultures that feared their strength. This connection to the lineage of feminine wisdom gives her a sense of belonging that she has never experienced before. She is not alone in her power. She is part of a vast network of feminine energy that spans across cultures and centuries. She can draw strength from this connection, can feel supported by the invisible presence of all the women who have walked this path before her. The archetypal awakening brings with it a profound shift in how she relates to other women. Where once she may have felt competitive or jealous, seeing other women as rivals for the limited attention or approval of the masculine world, now she begins to recognize other women as mirrors, as sisters, as fellow carriers of the sacred feminine flame. She understands that when one woman steps into her full power, she gives permission for all women to do the same. This sisterhood is not based on personal compatibility or shared interests, but on the deeper recognition of shared essence. Even with women whose personalities may clash with hers, she can recognize the divine feminine principle that lives within them, can honor the archetypal energy that they carry, even when their personal expressions of it may be different from her own. The awakening feminine within her also carries the energy of the revolutionary, the force that says no to systems and structures that are built on the suppression of life force, the domestication of wildness, the trading of authenticity for security. This revolutionary energy is not primarily concerned with changing external systems, though such change may be a natural result, but with liberating herself from the internal systems that have kept her small, compliant, and safe. She begins to understand that her very existence as a fully awakened feminine being is itself a revolutionary act. In a world that has been organized around the suppression of feminine wisdom, her refusal to hide her power, to dim her light, to make herself smaller for the comfort of others becomes an act of rebellion that can inspire transformation in everyone she encounters. The numinous quality of the archetypal feminine begins to permeate her daily existence. She carries with her now a sense of the sacred that does not depend on external circumstances or formal religious practice. She is connected to the mystery at the heart of existence, to the creative principle that brings forth galaxies and flowers with equal artistry, to the love that is the fundamental force of the universe. This numinous connection transforms even the most mundane aspects of her life. Making a meal becomes a sacred act of nourishment. Tending her living space becomes an act of creating sanctuary. Caring for her body becomes an act of honoring the temple of the divine. She moves through the world with the awareness that every moment is infused with sacred potential. As the archetypal feminine fully awakens within her, she realizes that this energy is not something she has acquired or achieved, but something she has remembered. These ancient patterns have been alive within her all along, waiting for the conditions of solitude and self-recognition that would allow them to emerge from the depths where they have been hibernating. She understands now that her journey through relationship and heartbreak, through seeking and disappointment, through the various attempts to find herself through others, has all been preparation for this moment of direct encounter with the source of feminine power that lives within her. Every loss has stripped away another layer of false identity. Every disappointment has cleared away another illusion. Every moment of solitude has created more space for this ancient wisdom to emerge. The woman who carries this archetypal awareness is no longer seeking completion from others because she is connected to the source of completeness itself. She no longer needs validation from the external world because she is plugged into the cosmic validation that recognizes her as a unique and essential expression of the creative principle. She no longer fears abandonment because she is connected to that which can never leave her, the eternal feminine that is her own deepest nature. From this place of archetypal connection, she begins to understand what it might mean to meet another person from wholeness rather than from need, from power rather than from powerlessness, from the fullness of her own feminine mystery rather than from the emptiness of seeking someone to complete her. The very possibility of authentic relationship between two whole beings rather than two halves, seeking to become one, begins to shimmer on the horizon of her awareness, like a distant but clearly visible shore. In the crucible of solitude, where the fires of truth burn away everything that is not essential, a profound transformation begins. This is not the gentle, gradual change of ordinary growth, but the radical metamorphosis that alchemists called the great work, the transmutation of base metals into gold. Here, in the sacred laboratory of her own consciousness, the base metals of self-doubt, external seeking, and conditional self-worth begin their mysterious transformation into the pure gold of self-love. But this is not the self-love that culture has taught her to recognize, not the superficial affirmations spoken to mirrors, not the forced positivity that tries to convince the mind of what the heart does not feel, not the narcissistic inflation that mistakes grandiosity for genuine self-regard. This is something far more profound and infinitely more challenging, the alchemical process by which a soul learns to see itself as the divine creative force that it is, worthy of the same tenderness it has spent years giving away to others who could not or would not reciprocate. Jung understood self-love as the foundation of all authentic relationship, for only when we have found our own center can we meet another from wholeness rather than need. Only when we have learned to be the source of our own validation can we receive validation from others without becoming addicted to it. Only when we have discovered the wellspring of love within ourselves can we share love freely, without the desperate undertone of someone trying to earn what they believe they do not inherently deserve. The alchemical process begins with the recognition of what must be dissolved. Like the alchemist who must first break down the crude material before the purification can begin, she must face the accumulated sediment of years spent believing that her worth was determined by external sources. This sediment is thick and stubborn, layered like geological strata, each layer representing a different period of her life when she learned to look outside herself for confirmation of her value. There is the layer formed in childhood, when love felt conditional upon good behavior, when approval had to be earned through performance, when the natural self-delight of a small child was gradually eroded by the message that she was acceptable only when she was being what others needed her to be. There is the adolescent layer, when her worth became entangled with her appearance, her popularity, her ability to attract the attention of others. There is the young adult layer, when she learned to measure her value by her achievements, by how much she could accomplish, by how useful she could be to others. Each layer must be dissolved in the acid bath of honest self-examination. This dissolution is not comfortable. There is grief in recognizing how much of her life force has been spent in service to the illusion that her worth was something that had to be proven rather than something that simply was. There is anger in seeing how much of her authentic self she has hidden, modified, or abandoned in pursuit of love and acceptance from others. There is fear in contemplating what it might mean to love herself exactly as she is, without the familiar project of self-improvement to occupy her attention. But beneath the grief, beneath the anger, beneath the fear, something golden begins to gleam in the depths of her being. It is the recognition that she has been carrying within herself all along, exactly what she has been seeking from others. The love she has been trying to earn, the acceptance she has been attempting to win, the validation she has been desperate to receive, all of it has been available within her own heart, waiting for her attention to turn inward with the same quality of care and tenderness she has so freely given to others. This recognition does not come all at once. Like the alchemical process itself, it happens in stages, each stage requiring its own particular kind of attention and patience. The first stage is what the alchemists called negrado, the blackening, the descent into the darkness of everything that has been rejected, denied, or hidden. In psychological terms, this is the encounter with the shadow, with all the aspects of herself that she has deemed unacceptable. She must look honestly at her neediness, at the ways she has sought love through manipulation rather than authentic expression. She must face her jealousy, her competitiveness, her capacity for pettiness and spite. She must acknowledge her fears, her insecurities, her tendency to abandon herself in the presence of someone whose approval she desires. She must see clearly the patterns of self-betrayal that have kept her trapped in relationships and situations that diminished rather than celebrated her. This shadow work is essential to the alchemical process, for she cannot truly love herself while she is busy rejecting parts of herself. The gold of self-love cannot emerge while she is still dividing herself into acceptable and unacceptable aspects, still trying to love only the parts of herself that meet some external standard of worthiness. The shadow must be acknowledged, integrated, understood as part of the complex wholeness that she is learning to embrace. In the darkness of this negrado phase, she begins to understand something revolutionary. Her so-called negative qualities are often her positive qualities in distorted form, twisted by years of suppression and shame. Her neediness is actually her capacity for intimacy, made desperate by deprivation. Her jealousy is actually her recognition of her own desires, made bitter by the belief that she does not deserve to have those desires fulfilled. Her anger is actually her healthy response to boundary violations, made toxic by years of being told that good women do not get angry. As she learns to see these shadow aspects with compassion rather than judgment, something begins to shift in the alchemical vessel of her consciousness. The harsh chemicals of self-criticism begin to neutralize. The corrosive acids of shame begin to dissolve. In their place, a different kind of chemistry begins to emerge, the gentle, nurturing chemistry of self-acceptance. The second stage of the alchemical process is albedo, the whitening, the purification that comes when the shadow has been integrated and the false structures of the ego begin to dissolve. This is the stage where she begins to experience herself without the familiar reference points of external validation, without the constant feedback loop of seeking approval and measuring herself against others' responses. She must learn to navigate by internal compass alone. This can be disorienting at first. She has been so accustomed to using others as mirrors, to understanding herself through their reactions to her, that existing without this external reflection feels like walking in a room where all the mirrors have been covered. She must learn to see herself from the inside out, to know her own worth not through others' recognition of it, but through her own direct experience of being alive, of being conscious, of being a unique expression of the creative force that moves through all things. In this albedo phase, she begins to develop what Jung called a relationship with the self, not the ego self that must constantly prove its worth, but the archetypal self that is connected to the source of all worth. This self does not need external validation because it is itself the source of validation. It does not need to be earned because it simply is. It does not need to be maintained through performance because it exists prior to all performance, the eternal witness that observes all the ego's activities without being diminished or enhanced by any of them. The cultivation of this relationship with the self requires a new kind of attention, the attention of someone learning to be in love. She must learn to notice herself with the same quality of fascinated interest she has directed toward others. She must learn to listen to her own thoughts and feelings with the same care she has given to understanding others' inner worlds. She must learn to tend her own needs with the same devotion she has offered to meeting others' needs. This is where the alchemy begins to reveal its golden nature. As she turns toward herself with genuine curiosity and care, she begins to discover aspects of her own being that surprise and delight her. She finds that her mind is more interesting than she had realized, capable of thoughts and insights that she had never bothered to explore because she was too busy trying to think thoughts that would please others. She discovers that her emotional world is richer and more complex than she had imagined, filled with subtle feelings and nuanced responses that she had never taken time to examine. She begins to appreciate her own sense of humor, her particular way of seeing the world, her unique combination of strengths and vulnerabilities that make her unlike anyone else who has ever existed. She starts to enjoy her own company, to look forward to time alone, not as an absence of others, but as a presence with herself. She finds that solitude is not loneliness, but rather a full, rich experience of being with someone she genuinely likes, herself. This growing appreciation for her own company creates a fundamental shift in how she approaches all her relationships. When being alone becomes a pleasure rather than a punishment, being with others becomes a choice rather than a desperate need. She can engage with people from a place of genuine interest and affection rather than from the anxious desire to be liked, to be chosen, to be found worthy of inclusion in their lives. The third stage of the alchemical process is rubedo, the reddening, the emergence of the divine child, the birth of the new self that carries both human and divine qualities. This is the stage where self-love reveals itself not as an endpoint but as a beginning, not as an achievement to be maintained, but as a natural state to be inhabited. The gold that has been refined in the crucible of solitude is not meant to be hoarded but to be shared, not meant to be admired in isolation but to be offered as a gift to the world. But the sharing that emerges from this alchemical transformation is fundamentally different from the giving she engaged in before. Previously, her giving was often motivated by the hope of receiving something in return: love, approval, security, a sense of worth. Now, her giving flows from abundance rather than emptiness, from love rather than need, from the natural overflow of a cup that is already full, rather than from the desperate attempt to fill a cup that seems perpetually empty. This transformation in the quality of her giving transforms the quality of everything she receives in return. When she gives from wholeness, she attracts others who are capable of meeting her from their own wholeness. When she shares from authenticity, she draws to herself people who are ready for authentic connection. When she loves from the centered place of self-love, she becomes magnetic to others who are capable of genuine love, rather than those who are seeking someone to heal their wounds or fill their emptiness. Jung understood that the development of genuine self-love requires what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. In the context of self-love, this means learning to hold both unconditional acceptance and the desire for growth both complete self-approval and the recognition that change is possible, both satisfaction with who she is now and excitement about who she is becoming. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the alchemical process, learning to love herself not despite her imperfections, but including her imperfections, not in spite of her areas of growth, but because of her capacity to grow, not as a finished product, but as a dynamic, evolving work of art that is always in the process of becoming more itself. The woman who emerges from this alchemical transformation understands that self-love is not a destination, but a practice, not a state to be achieved once and then maintained, but a way of being that must be chosen again and again, moment by moment, in the countless small interactions she has with herself throughout each day. It is the practice of speaking to herself with kindness, of treating her body with respect, of honoring her needs without apology, of setting boundaries without guilt, of pursuing her dreams without requiring anyone else's permission. This practice of self-love extends into every area of her life. She begins to make choices based on what truly serves her highest good, rather than what she thinks will make others happy. She starts to say no to things that deplete her energy, and yes, to things that nourish her soul. She learns to trust her own judgment, to value her own opinions, to respect her own decisions, even when they are not understood or supported by others. The alchemy of self-love also transforms her relationship with her body, where once she may have seen her physical form as something to be improved, corrected, or hidden, she begins to experience her body as the sacred vessel through which she experiences life, the temple that houses her consciousness, the instrument through which she expresses her unique gifts to the world. She learns to listen to her body's wisdom, to honor its needs, to appreciate its capacity for pleasure, movement, and sensation. This embodied self-love creates a radiance that is unmistakable to others. There is something magnetic about a woman who inhabits her body with comfort and appreciation, who moves through the world with the confidence that comes from being at home in her own skin. This magnetism is not based on conforming to external standards of beauty, but on the internal alignment that occurs when someone genuinely likes and respects the person they are being. The alchemical process also transforms her relationship with her desires, where once her wanting may have felt like evidence of her inadequacy, proof that she was lacking something essential, that she was not content with what she had been given. Now her desires begin to feel like communications from her deepest self, guidance about the direction her life wants to take, invitations to expand into new expressions of her evolving identity. She learns to honor her desires not as demands that must be immediately fulfilled, but as important information about what brings her alive, what calls to her soul, what wants to be birthed through her unique presence in the world. She stops apologizing for wanting what she wants and starts to see her desires as clues to her purpose, as breadcrumbs leading her toward the fullest expression of who she is meant to become. This relationship with desire creates a profound shift in how she approaches goal setting and manifestation. Rather than trying to force outcomes or manipulate circumstances to get what she thinks she needs, she learns to align herself with her authentic desires and then trust that life will conspire to support her in ways that are often more creative and fulfilling than what she could have imagined on her own. The gold of self-love that emerges from this alchemical process is not static but dynamic, not fixed but flowing. It is love that grows stronger with practice, love that deepens with attention, love that expands to encompass not just herself, but everything she encounters. For the woman who has learned to truly love herself, discovers that self-love is not separate from love for others, but is actually the foundation that makes genuine love for others possible. When she no longer needs others to complete her, she can appreciate them for who they are, rather than for what they can provide. When she no longer needs others to validate her worth, she can see their worth clearly without the distorting lens of need. When she no longer needs others to make her happy, she can share in their happiness without expectation, can offer support in their struggles without trying to fix them, can be present with them in their journey without needing them to be at any particular place in that journey. This is the ultimate gift of the alchemical transformation, the recognition that the love she has been seeking outside herself has been growing inside herself all along, waiting for her attention, waiting for her recognition, waiting for her to turn toward it with the same passion and dedication she has turned toward seeking love from others. The crucible of solitude has revealed what was always true, but rarely recognized. She is both the lover and the beloved, both the seeker and the sought, both the question and the answer to the question of her own worth. The gold that has been refined in the crucible of her consciousness is not meant to be kept in isolation, but to be shared with a world that is hungry for authentic love, genuine connection, real intimacy between whole people rather than desperate merging between wounded parts. She carries within her now the capacity to love without losing herself, to give without depleting herself, to receive without feeling indebted, to be in relationship without sacrificing her independence, to be intimate without abandoning her boundaries. The alchemical process has taught her that self-love is not selfish, but sacred, not narcissistic, but necessary, not a luxury, but a requirement for anyone who wants to contribute something meaningful to the world. For how can she give what she does not have? How can she offer love to others if she has not learned to love herself? How can she create healing in her relationships if she has not done the work of healing her relationship with herself? The woman who emerges from this alchemical transformation carries within her a new quality of presence, a settled confidence that comes not from having achieved some external measure of success, but from having found the source of validation within herself. She radiates the quiet power of someone who knows her own worth, who does not need others to reflect that worth back to her, who can afford to be generous because she is no longer operating from a place of scarcity. This is the gold that was always there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be refined, waiting to be recognized as the treasure it has always been. The alchemical process has not created something new, but has revealed what was always true. She is already whole, already complete, already worthy of the love she has been seeking. The journey inward has led her not to some distant treasure, but to the recognition that she herself is the treasure, that the love she has been seeking everywhere else has been living within her all along, patient as stone, faithful as sunrise, waiting for her homecoming. There comes a moment in the depths of solitary practice when the very fabric of understanding turns inside out, revealing a truth so paradoxical it can only be felt, never fully grasped by the rational mind. She sits in her sanctuary of chosen aloneness and feels something extraordinary stirring, not the familiar ache of loneliness she once knew, but its exact opposite. A fullness so complete it borders on emptiness, an emptiness so rich it overflows with presence. This is the mystery Jung called enantiodromia, the principle by which all things, when carried to their extreme, transform into their opposite. Like the deepest midnight that gives birth to dawn, her profound solitude has alchemically transmuted into its opposite, an unprecedented capacity for connection. Not the desperate, grasping connection of her former self, but something entirely new, a quality of intimacy that emerges only from those who have first learned to be intimate with themselves. She traces this transformation with wonder, feeling how the months of turning inward have not closed her heart, but opened it in ways she never imagined possible. The more deeply she has journeyed into her own wilderness, the more she has discovered the universal patterns that connect all beings. In learning to love her own company, she has paradoxically learned to love the company of others with a freedom that was impossible when she needed them to fill the void within herself. The paradox reveals itself in small moments of recognition. She notices how conversations flow differently now, how presence feels different when she enters a room. Where once she might have scanned faces for signs of approval or interest, now she simply arrives, whole, complete, carrying her own flame. People sense this wholeness in ways that bypass words, drawn to the quality of someone who has learned to be truly alone and found it not frightening but liberating. This is not the isolation of the wounded heart building walls against further injury. This is the magnificent solitude of the individuated soul, the state Jung described as the goal of all psychological development, to become so completely oneself that one can meet others as they truly are, without the distorting lens of personal need. Her solitude has taught her the difference between connection that completes and connection that enhances, between love that fills a void and love that celebrates abundance. She remembers the teachings of the mystics who spoke of this same paradox in spiritual terms, how the desert fathers found God not in the crowded marketplace, but in the vast emptiness of their hermit caves, how the Buddha discovered compassion for all beings only after sitting alone beneath the Bodhi tree for countless nights. The spiritual journey and the psychological journey converge at this point. Both require a descent into the solitude of the self to discover the universal heart that beats within individual existence. In her morning meditations, she feels this truth embodied in her very cells. The space within her that was once hollow with longing has been filled by her own presence, her own witness, her own loving attention, and from this fullness something miraculous emerges, the ability to offer genuine presence to others without agenda, without the unconscious calculation of what she might receive in return. Her interactions become gifts, freely given rather than transactions desperately negotiated. The quality of her attention has transformed. Where once she listened with half her consciousness, while the other half monitored whether she was being seen, heard, valued, now she listens with the fullness of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to lose. This complete attention becomes a form of love in itself, a recognition of the other's being that asks for nothing while offering everything. She observes how this shift ripples through every relationship in her life. Friends notice something different, though they cannot name it. Conversations deepen naturally. Masks fall away. Without force, authentic sharing emerges where once there was only pleasant superficiality. She has become like clear water, transparent enough that others can see themselves, reflected truly, still enough that the reflections are undistorted by her own emotional turbulence. The paradox extends into her relationship with desire itself. The more complete she feels in solitude, the more clearly she can discern the difference between genuine desire and neurotic need. Attraction, when it arises, feels clean, uncomplicated by the desperate undertones that once colored every romantic encounter. She can feel drawn to someone without immediately calculating how they might fit into the architecture of her loneliness, can appreciate beauty without needing to possess it, can enjoy connection without fearing its loss. This is the psychological alchemy Jung witnessed in his most individuated patients, the transformation of the needy ego into the generous self, the evolution from unconscious seeking to conscious offering. Her solitude has not made her selfish, but selfless in the truest sense, no longer driven by the small self's endless appetites, but guided by the larger self's natural generosity. She experiences moments of such profound contentment in her own company that the very idea of seeking completion outside herself seems not just unnecessary but impossible. How can one seek to complete what is already whole? How can one hunger for what one has already found? The seeking mind that once drove her from relationship to relationship, from experience to experience, has quieted into a state of natural abundance that wants for nothing while remaining open to everything. Yet this is not a static state but a dynamic equilibrium, like a tree rooted so deeply it can sway freely in any wind. Her inner stability allows for greater flexibility in relationship, greater spontaneity in connection. She can risk more because she has less to lose, can love more freely because she is not trying to secure anything through love. This is the paradox of psychological maturity. The more individually complete one becomes, the more capable one becomes of genuine union. She reflects on the lovers and friends of her past, feeling compassion for the young woman who sought in them what could only be found within herself. There is no judgment in this reflection, only the tender recognition of a soul learning to come home to itself. She understands now that every relationship, even the most painful ones, were teaching her this essential lesson, that the love she sought everywhere else was always awaiting her discovery within her own heart. The evenings in her solitary home have become temples of presence. She moves through her simple rituals, preparing tea, tending plants, reading by candlelight, with the reverence of one who has learned that being alone with oneself is not a consolation prize, but the grand prize itself. Each moment of solitude adds another layer to her capacity. For presence, another note to the symphony of her self-knowledge. She begins to understand what the great spiritual teachers meant when they spoke of non-attachment. It is not indifference or emotional numbness, but the freedom that comes from needing nothing while appreciating everything. Her relationships begin to take on this quality, engaged but not entangled, caring but not clinging, present but not possessive. She can love fully because she holds lightly, can commit deeply because she chooses freely. The shadow work she has done in solitude now bears its fruit in relationship. Having faced her own darkness with compassion, she can witness the darkness in others without recoil or judgment. Having learned to love her own contradictions, she can hold space for the contradictions in those she cares about. The integration of her shadow has made her more human, not less, more capable of authentic connection, because she no longer needs to maintain the exhausting pretense of perfection. She notices how different it feels to share herself from abundance rather than scarcity. Her stories, her thoughts, her very presence become offerings rather than bids for validation. She can speak her truth without needing others to agree with it, can share her feelings without requiring others to fix them, can reveal her vulnerabilities without expecting others to heal them. This is the mature heart that emerges from deep solitude, self-contained enough to be genuinely generous. The quality of love she can now offer and receive has transformed entirely. It is no longer the love that says, "I need you to be happy," but the love that says, "I am happy, and from this happiness, I choose to share my life with you." It is no longer the love that seeks to merge and dissolve boundaries, but the love that honors the sacred separateness that makes true meeting possible. Two wholes can dance together in ways that two halves, seeking completion in each other, never can. She experiences what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism by which opposites are reconciled at a higher level. Her solitude and her capacity for connection are no longer in opposition but in dynamic relationship, each feeding and enhancing the other. Time alone prepares her for time with others. Time with others sends her back to solitude, with deeper questions and richer material for contemplation. The rhythm between them becomes a sacred dance rather than a frantic oscillation. In quiet moments, she feels the presence of what mystics have called the beloved, not a person to be found in the outer world, but the divine principle that dwells within the individuated heart. This inner beloved is both her deepest self and the source of her capacity to love others truly. It is the foundation from which all authentic relationship flows, the wellspring that ensures she will never again seek from another what she has learned to find within herself. The loneliness that once drove her into the arms of others who could not hold her has been transformed into something she can barely name, a kind of cosmic solitude that connects her to everything while belonging to nothing. She is alone in the way that mountains are alone, rivers are alone, stars are alone, not isolated but singular, not separate but unique, carrying within their solitude the very essence of what they have to offer the world. She begins to see her past relationships with new eyes, understanding how each one was shaped by the unconscious belief that love meant merging, that intimacy required the dissolution of self. Now she glimpses the possibility of love between two beings who remain magnificently themselves, while choosing to walk together, who enhance each other's wholeness rather than completing each other's incompleteness. This is the love that becomes possible only after one has learned to love oneself with the same devotion once reserved for others. The empty spaces in her life, the quiet evenings, the solitary meals, the conversations with her own reflection no longer feel like voids to be filled, but like sacred chambers where the most important work of being human takes place. In these spaces, she communes with the depths of her own psyche, dialogues with the archetypes that live in every human heart, tends the garden of her inner life, with the patience of one who has learned that the most important crops grow slowly and cannot be rushed. Her social interactions become experiments in this new way of being. She practices showing up as herself rather than as the version of herself she thinks others want to see. She experiments with speaking truth even when it might disappoint, with setting boundaries even when it might displease, with offering presence even when she receives nothing in return. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to practice love from wholeness rather than love from need. The quality of people drawn to her begins to shift. Those who once might have been attracted to her availability, her willingness to shape herself around their needs, begin to fall away. In their place, different souls appear, those who are also walking the path of individuation, who recognize in her the qualities they are cultivating in themselves. Her relationships become mutual celebrations of becoming rather than mutual attempts at completion. She discovers that the deepest intimacy is not the merging of two incomplete beings, but the meeting of two complete ones who choose to share their completeness. In this space, vulnerability becomes strength rather than weakness. Sharing becomes offering rather than seeking. Love becomes celebration rather than salvation. The relationship dynamics that once felt like survival techniques, the careful monitoring of moods, the strategic giving and withholding, the unconscious negotiations of power, dissolve into the simple presence of two beings who have learned to be at home in their own skin. The fear of being alone that once drove her into unsuitable partnerships has transformed into something unrecognizable, a love of solitude so complete that it has paradoxically prepared her for the kind of partnership that enhances rather than threatens her inner peace. She no longer seeks someone to complete her, but someone to dance with in their mutual completeness, someone who celebrates her wholeness rather than trying to fill her emptiness. This transformation reveals the lie embedded in so much of our cultural understanding of love, the belief that we are incomplete beings seeking our other half, that romantic love is about two halves making a whole. She has discovered through her solitary journey that love at its highest is the celebration of two wholes choosing to create something new together while remaining magnificently themselves. The lovers do not disappear into each other but become more themselves through their loving. In her deepest meditations, she touches the place where Jung's psychology meets the wisdom of the ages, the understanding that the journey inward is simultaneously the journey toward authentic connection with others. The self that emerges from this journey is not a fortress but a fountain, not a closed system but an open heart that can love without losing itself, connect without dissolving, commit without compromising the essential integrity that makes genuine love possible. She sits in her garden as twilight approaches, feeling the miracle of her own transformation. The woman who once could not bear to be alone with her own thoughts now treasures this time of day when the world grows quiet and she can sink into the profound companionship of her own awakened consciousness. The silence that once felt like abandonment now feels like homecoming. The solitude that once felt like punishment now feels like the greatest gift she has ever given herself. This is the paradox of fulfilled emptiness, that in learning to need nothing from others, she has become capable of receiving everything they have to offer. In releasing her grip on love, love has finally become free to find her. In choosing herself first and completely, she has prepared the ground for choosing another from a place of abundance rather than scarcity, wholeness rather than neediness, joy rather than desperation. The empty chair across from her at dinner no longer speaks of loneliness but of possibility, not the desperate possibility of being rescued from herself, but the magnificent possibility of sharing her self-discovered riches with another soul who has undertaken their own journey to wholeness. She is no longer waiting to be chosen but preparing to choose, no longer seeking to be loved but learning to love from the inexhaustible source she has found within her own transformed heart. This is the gift her solitude has given her, not the ability to do without love, but the capacity to recognize love when it arrives, wearing the face of truth rather than the mask of need. She has learned to distinguish between the love that completes and the love that celebrates, between the love that heals wounds and the love that honors wholeness, between the love that saves and the love that simply, purely, authentically loves. As night settles around her sanctuary of solitude, she feels the presence of all those who have walked this path before her, the mystics and poets, the philosophers and healers, the ordinary souls who have discovered the extraordinary truth that the deepest human connection emerges not from need, but from abundance, not from seeking, but from finding, not from emptiness, but from the fulfilled emptiness that contains all possibilities while grasping none. She has become the paradox incarnate, alone yet connected, empty yet full, needing nothing yet open to everything. This is the achievement of psychological individuation, the goal toward which Jung directed all his work, with souls seeking wholeness. She has not learned to do without love, but to love without doing, to be love rather than to seek love, to embody the very quality she once desperately pursued in others. In this moment of perfect solitude, surrounded by the silence that has become her teacher and companion, she feels more connected to the human family than ever before. Her individual journey has led her to the universal heart. Her personal healing has prepared her for impersonal love. Her solitary work has equipped her for the sacred work of relationship that honors both union and autonomy as expressions of the same divine principle. The woman who once feared being alone with her thoughts now recognizes that these thoughts, when met with compassionate awareness, are the very substance from which authentic relationship is built. She has learned to dialogue with her own unconscious, to befriend her own shadow, to honor her own contradictions, and in doing so, has developed the capacity to meet others in their full complexity without the need to change or fix or complete them. This is the alchemy of solitude. It transforms the base metal of neediness into the gold of generous love, the lead of desperation into the radiance of choice, the iron of attachment into the silk of connection that flows and dances without clinging. She has discovered what Jung meant when he wrote of love as a difficult task. Not difficult because it is painful, but difficult because it requires the full development of the individual before it can be truly accomplished. Her solitary practice has taught her to recognize the difference between love that asks, "What can you give me?" and love that asks, "What can I give you?" Between love that depletes and love that replenishes, between love that diminishes both parties and love that enhances them. She has learned through the patient work of being alone that genuine love is not two people looking at each other, but two people looking in the same direction, toward truth, toward growth, toward the mystery that is always, calling them deeper into themselves and, paradoxically, closer to each other. The rooms of her home, once echoing with loneliness, now resonate with a presence so full it seems to contain multitudes. She moves through her daily rituals, the morning meditation, the afternoon writing, the evening reflection, feeling herself held by an invisible community of all those who have chosen the difficult path of individuation, who have learned that the journey inward leads paradoxically outward, that the work of becoming oneself prepares one for the sacred work of meeting another in their becoming. She understands now what Jung meant when he spoke of relationship as the greatest test of individuation. It is easy to maintain one's center in solitude. The real challenge comes in maintaining that center while opening to another. But this is precisely what her solitary work has prepared her for. Not to remain forever alone, but to bring to relationship the gift of a self so complete that it can love without losing itself, so grounded that it can dance without falling, so full that it can pour itself out without emptying. This paradox of fulfilled emptiness extends into every aspect of her being, her sexual energy no longer seeking validation or connection through desperation, has transformed into something sacred, a force that honors both her own wholeness and the wholeness of any potential partner. Her emotional life, no longer dependent on external circumstances for its stability, has become a source of strength she can draw upon in any situation. Her mental clarity, sharpened by months of honest self-reflection, allows her to see others clearly rather than through the projections of her own needs. She feels herself standing at a threshold between worlds, the world of unconscious seeking and the world of conscious choosing, the world of need-based relationships, and the world of abundance-based love. Behind her lies the landscape of her former life, littered with the debris of connections forged from desperation, relationships that promised salvation but delivered only temporary relief from the discomfort of being alone with herself. Ahead lies unknown territory, the possibility of love that enhances rather than completes, connections that celebrate rather than rescue, intimacy that honors rather than engulfs. The empty space beside her in bed, once a constant reminder of what she lacked, has become a symbol of what she has found. Room for another to join her wholeness rather than fill her emptiness. Space for someone to complement her completeness rather than complete her incompleteness. She sleeps deeply now, not because she has given up on love, but because she has found within herself the love that makes all other love possible. In moments of profound stillness, she touches the place where her individual consciousness meets the universal consciousness, where her personal journey intersects with the archetypal journey every soul must take toward wholeness. She sees herself as part of an ancient lineage of those who have chosen the difficult path of self-discovery, who have learned that the way to love others truly is first to love oneself completely. The meditation cushion where she sits each morning has become an altar to this paradox, the place where solitude transforms into connection, where emptiness reveals its fullness, where the individual discovers their universality. Here, in the silence of her own company, she prepares daily for the possibility of meeting another who has undertaken their own journey to wholeness, who brings to relationship not need, but abundance, not seeking, but finding, not emptiness, but the fulfilled emptiness that can hold anything without being diminished. She recognizes this state as what Jung called the achievement of the self, not the small, ego-driven self that seeks completion outside itself, but the larger self that contains all possibilities, the self that is simultaneously individual and universal, solitary and connected, empty and full. This self does not seek relationship, but creates the conditions in which authentic relationship becomes possible. Does not pursue love, but embodies the very quality that makes love recognizable when it appears. The work of solitude has revealed to her the deepest secret of human connection, that we can only love others to the degree that we have learned to love ourselves, can only offer presence to the degree that we have learned to be present with our own experience, can only meet another in their wholeness to the degree that we have discovered our own. Her journey into aloneness has been, she now sees, a journey toward the kind of togetherness that honors rather than diminishes the individuals who choose it. As she prepares for sleep, surrounded by the profound peace of her solitary sanctuary, she feels gratitude for the paradox that has transformed her life. She is alone and yet not alone, empty and yet overflowing, complete and yet still becoming. She has learned the greatest secret of all, that love is not something we find outside ourselves, but something we become through the patient, tender work of befriending our own solitary souls. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice this paradoxical love, to offer presence without agenda, to connect without clinging, to love without losing herself in loving. She has become what Jung envisioned as the goal of all psychological development, an individual so complete in themselves that they can truly meet another, so comfortable with solitude that they can genuinely celebrate connection, so fulfilled in emptiness that they can overflow with love. This is the mystery of fulfilled emptiness, that it is not a state to be transcended, but a foundation to be built upon, not a problem to be solved, but a paradox to be lived, not an ending, but a beginning of love's truest possibility. She has learned that the deepest human connections emerge not from two half people seeking wholeness in each other, but from two whole people choosing to create something greater than themselves, while remaining magnificently, paradoxically, beautifully themselves. The silence that holds her now is pregnant with infinite possibility, not the possibility of being rescued from her aloneness, but the possibility of sharing her wholeness with another who has discovered their own. She has found what every soul seeks, not love as completion, but love as celebration, not love as salvation, but love as sacred recognition of the divine spark that burns equally bright in every individuated heart. And so she rests in the paradox, neither seeking to resolve it, nor being troubled by its mystery, understanding finally that some truths are too large for the mind to grasp and can only be lived by the heart that has learned to beat in perfect rhythm with its own deepest nature. She is alone and not alone, empty and overflowing, seeking nothing and open to everything. The living embodiment of love's greatest paradox, the fulfilled emptiness that makes all authentic connection possible. From the deep well of solitude, from the sacred hermitage where you have learned to love your own company, something new emerges, not walls built from fear, but thresholds crafted from wisdom. These are the sacred boundaries born not of defensiveness, but of reverence, not of rejection, but of recognition. They arise from the profound understanding that you are not an open field where anyone may graze, but a temple, a sacred space that requires conscious tending, mindful approach, and genuine reverence for entry. Jung understood that individuation creates what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox, to be both open and protected, both loving and discerning, both vulnerable and strong. The sacred boundaries embody this transcendent function. They are permeable to authentic connection, while remaining impermeable to the half-hearted love that once satisfied your starving heart. They invite genuine encounter while repelling the casual intrusions of those who would consume your energy without offering anything of equal value in return. This discernment is not something you think your way into. It is something you feel your way toward, the way a plant turns naturally toward light. Your nervous system, refined by the deep listening of solitude, now recognizes the difference between authentic presence and performance, between genuine interest and superficial charm, between someone who sees you and someone who sees only what they want from you. This recognition happens below the level of rational thought, in the cellular wisdom that has learned to distinguish nourishment from poison. The temple of your being is not a metaphor, but a living reality. Through the patient work of the hermitage, you have consecrated the space of yourself, not in any religious sense, but in the deepest psychological sense. You have learned to approach your own inner life with the same reverence that ancient pilgrims brought to sacred shrines. You have discovered that your thoughts, feelings, dreams, and creative impulses are not casual entertainment, but precious emanations of the self, worthy of protection and careful cultivation. This reverence for your own inner sanctity creates an energetic field around you that others can sense, even if they cannot name it. Some are drawn to this field like moths to flame, not because they understand what they are encountering, but because wholeness has a magnetic quality that calls to the fractured parts of others. But the sacred boundaries ensure that only those who can match your level of reverence are granted access to the inner chambers of your being. The boundaries begin with your relationship to time. No longer do you scatter your hours like coins thrown carelessly into a fountain, hoping that somehow this expenditure will purchase the love you seek. Instead, you become a careful steward of your temporal resources, understanding that how you spend your time is how you spend your life. You learn to say no to invitations that feel obligatory rather than genuine, to conversations that drain rather than nourish, to activities that serve others' agendas while neglecting your own soul's calling. This is not selfishness, it is sacred stewardship. You have discovered that your time, your energy, your attention are not infinite resources to be given away indiscriminately, but precious gifts that must be offered consciously, intentionally to people and pursuits that honor their value. The temple keeper does not leave the doors open for anyone to wander through at will. She carefully tends the entrance, ensuring that those who enter come with clean hands and genuine hearts. The sacred boundaries extend to your emotional space. You no longer accept emotional dumping as a form of intimacy, nor do you mistake drama for depth. Your nervous system, calibrated by solitude to recognize peace as your natural state, now recoils from chaos that masquerades as passion, from intensity that substitutes volume for substance. You learn to distinguish between someone sharing their authentic experience and someone using your emotional space as a dumping ground for their unprocessed material. This discernment is not cold, it is compassionate. You can feel genuine empathy for someone's struggle without taking responsibility for solving it. You can offer support without becoming enmeshed. You can listen with an open heart while maintaining clear boundaries about what is yours to carry and what belongs to the other person. The temple of your being has space for visitors, but it does not become a refugee camp for others' unresolved pain. Perhaps most importantly, the sacred boundaries protect your creative and spiritual space, that tender realm where your authentic self is constantly being born and reborn. You learn to recognize the subtle ways that others' expectations, opinions, and agendas can infiltrate this sacred space, imposing their vision of who you should be over your own emerging understanding of who you are. The boundaries create a protected environment where your authentic self can continue to unfold without constant interference or judgment. This protection manifests in small but significant ways. You stop explaining yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand you. You cease seeking approval from those whose values are fundamentally different from your own. You no longer try to make your authentic choices palatable to people who prefer you diminished. The sacred boundaries hold space for you to be yourself fully, without apology or modification. The boundaries are not rigid walls, but living membranes, more like the skin of a healthy cell than the walls of a fortress. They breathe, they adjust, they open to genuine nourishment and close to what would harm or deplete. Like all healthy boundaries, they serve not to separate, but to create the conditions in which authentic connection becomes possible. Jung spoke of the transcendent function as the psychological mechanism that emerges when conscious and unconscious contents unite to create a new level of understanding. The sacred boundaries embody this transcendent function in relationship. They hold the tension between openness and protection, between vulnerability and strength, between love and discernment, until a new way of relating emerges that honors both your need for connection and your need for integrity. This new way of relating transforms every interaction. Where once you might have accepted breadcrumbs of attention from emotionally unavailable people, now you recognize that you deserve the full presence of someone who can meet you completely. Where once you might have tolerated disrespect disguised as teasing or honesty, now you calmly remove yourself from conversations that diminish your worth. Where once you might have explained yourself endlessly to people who refuse to understand, now you trust that the right people will recognize your authenticity without extensive justification. The sacred boundaries teach you to honor your own rhythms and needs without apology. You learn that it is not selfish to need time alone to recharge, but essential. You understand that it is not unfriendly to prefer deep conversation over small talk, but authentic. You recognize that it is not antisocial to choose solitude over superficial social gatherings, but wise self-care that ensures you have something genuine to offer when you do choose to connect. These boundaries create what Jung called temenos, a sacred space in which transformation can occur safely. Within the protected space of your well-boundaried life, you continue to evolve, to create, to discover new aspects of yourself that require shelter and nurturing before they are strong enough to meet the world. The boundaries ensure that this evolution happens at its natural pace, without pressure or interference from those who would rush you toward their vision of who you should become. The temple of your being begins to attract different kinds of people, not those who are drawn to your brokenness or neediness, but those who recognize and appreciate your wholeness. These people approach with respect rather than expectation, with curiosity rather than agenda, with genuine interest in who you are rather than what you can provide. They understand that access to your inner world is a privilege, not a right, and they conduct themselves accordingly. This shift in who you attract happens naturally, without effort or strategy. Wholeness calls to wholeness across the crowded marketplace of hearts. Those who have done their own work recognize the quality of presence that emerges from someone who has learned to love themselves completely. They do not mistake your boundaries for rejection or your discernment for coldness. They recognize them as signs of someone who knows their own worth and expects others to recognize it as well. The sacred boundaries also transform your relationship to rejection and disappointment. When someone cannot meet you at the level of authenticity and presence you require, their inability to do so becomes information rather than judgment. Their rejection reveals compatibility rather than inadequacy. You begin to understand that not every person is meant to have access to every level of your being, and this understanding brings relief rather than sadness. You learn to celebrate the boundaries as much as the connections they enable. Each no to what diminishes you creates space for a yes to what nourishes you. Each person you release who cannot meet you authentically makes room for someone who can. Each boundary you maintain strengthens your capacity to offer genuine intimacy to those who prove themselves worthy of such a gift. The temple of your being becomes a place of refuge, not only for yourself, but for others who are weary of superficial connection and hungry for authentic encounter. Your willingness to maintain sacred boundaries gives others permission to establish their own. Your refusal to accept half-hearted love raises the standard for how everyone in your orbit expects to be treated. Your reverence for your own worth becomes a teaching that ripples out into the world, showing others what it looks like to honor the temple of human consciousness. This is how the sacred boundaries become not barriers but bridges, not walls that separate but thresholds that connect those who are ready for genuine intimacy. They filter out the noise and chaos of unconscious relating, creating space for the rare and precious encounters that feed the soul rather than depleting it. They ensure that when you do open the doors of your inner temple, what enters is worthy of the sacred space you have worked so carefully to create. In honoring the temple of your being through sacred boundaries, you discover that you are not shutting out love, but calling it forth in its most authentic form. You are not becoming less available, but more available, available for the kind of connection that honors the fullness of who you are, rather than demanding you diminish yourself to make others comfortable. You are not becoming harder, but softer, soft enough to remain open to genuine love, while strong enough to resist what would harm or deplete your carefully tended wholeness. The sacred boundaries are love in action, love for yourself, love for the authentic connections they make possible, love for the very principle of conscious relationship that honors the divine spark within each being. They are the gift of someone who has learned to recognize their own worth and refuses to settle for anything less than encounters that match the sacredness they have discovered within themselves. She emerges from the depths of her solitary journey like one who has traveled to the underworld and returned with treasures that cannot be seen but can be felt in every gesture, every word, every quality of presence she brings to the world. This is the hero's return that Joseph Campbell wrote about, the completion of the great circular journey that takes the seeker away from everything familiar and brings her back transformed, carrying within her consciousness the gold that was mined in the darkness, the wisdom that was forged in the fire of facing herself completely. But unlike the mythic heroes whose journeys took them across vast landscapes and through external adventures, her odyssey has been an interior one. The dragons she has slayed were the dragons of self-doubt and external seeking. The treasures she has discovered were buried not in distant caves, but in the depths of her own psyche. The kingdom she has learned to rule is the vast inner territory of her own authentic selfhood. The woman who returns from this journey is recognizable and yet utterly changed. She carries herself differently now, with the quiet confidence of someone who has found the source of validation within herself and no longer needs to seek it from others. There is a settledness about her, a quality of being at home in her own skin that creates a magnetic field around her. She radiates the unmistakable energy of someone who genuinely likes herself, who enjoys her own company, who has made peace with her own complexity. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, is not a journey away from relationship, but a journey that prepares us for authentic relationship. The work of finding ourselves, of integrating our shadow, of connecting with the self that lies beneath the ego's constructions, is not selfish, but ultimately generous. For only when we have found our own center can we meet another from wholeness rather than from the fragmented neediness that characterizes so much of what passes for love in the modern world. Love, she understands now, is no longer a hunger that drives her to seek completion in others. The desperate edge that once characterized her approach to relationship, the need to be chosen, to be found worthy, to be rescued from the loneliness that felt like a verdict on her essential unlovability, has been transmuted into something entirely different. Love has become a choice, a conscious decision to share the abundance she has discovered within herself, rather than an attempt to fill the emptiness she no longer carries. This transformation changes everything about how she moves through the world of human connection. Where once she may have approached potential partners with the unconscious question, "Can you love me enough to make me feel whole?" Now she approaches with the question, "Are you someone I would choose to share my wholeness with?" The shift is subtle but profound, the difference between begging and offering, between seeking and sharing, between need and choice. The loneliness that once felt like evidence of her inadequacy has revealed itself to be something entirely different. Not the punishment of being unlovable, but the invitation to discover that she is already whole, already complete, already sufficient unto herself. The solitude that she once feared has become her sanctuary, the place where she connects with the source of love that was never dependent on others' recognition of her worth. She has learned the difference between loneliness and aloneness, between isolation and solitude, between being alone and being lonely. Loneliness, she now understands, is not actually about the absence of others, but about the absence of connection to herself. She can be lonely in a crowded room if she has abandoned herself to please others, and she can be utterly content in complete solitude when she is present with the richness of her own inner world. This understanding transforms her entire approach to relationship. She no longer sees being alone as a problem to be solved by finding someone, anyone, to fill the space beside her. She sees solitude as a natural and necessary part of human existence, as essential to psychological health as sleep is to physical health. She understands that someone who cannot be happy alone is not ready for the kind of relationship that adds to life, rather than compensating for what feels missing from life. The happiness she has found in solitude has not closed her heart to connection, but has prepared her heart for a quality of connection that was not possible before. When happiness comes from within rather than from others, she can approach relationship without the desperate undertone of someone trying to get something they lack. She can be present with others without the hidden agenda of needing them to make her feel better about herself, without the subtle manipulation of trying to earn their love, without the exhausting performance of being whoever she thinks they want her to be. Jung's deepest insight, which she now understands not as theory but as lived reality, is that authentic love can only flow between two complete beings who choose each other not from neediness but from the overflow of their individual wholeness. This is a radical departure from the romantic mythology that suggests we are all incomplete until we find our other half, that love is about finding someone who can complete us, that the highest expression of intimacy is the merging of two people into one. She sees now that this mythology, however seductive, is actually the description of psychological fusion rather than love, of mutual dependence rather than authentic intimacy, of two incomplete people trying to use each other to feel whole, rather than two whole people choosing to share their completeness. True love, she understands, requires the existence of two separate, complete individuals who can come together without losing themselves, who can be intimate without abandoning their boundaries, who can share deeply without merging identically. This kind of love requires something that the old, needy version of herself could never have offered: the capacity to love someone exactly as they are, rather than as who she needs them to be, to make her feel secure, valuable, or complete. When she no longer needs others to validate her worth, she can see their worth clearly. When she no longer needs others to make her happy, she can appreciate their happiness without trying to control it. When she no longer needs others to complete her, she can celebrate their completeness without feeling threatened by it. The woman who returns from the journey of individuation brings with her a new quality of presence that transforms every interaction she has. There is something profoundly attractive about someone who is genuinely content with themselves, who radiates the settled confidence that comes from self-acceptance, who engages with others from curiosity and affection rather than from need and expectation. This attractiveness is not the calculated appeal of someone trying to win approval, but the natural magnetism of someone who has found their own center. She draws to herself people who are similarly centered, who are also on the path of individuation, who understand that the purpose of relationship is not to heal each other's wounds, but to celebrate each other's wholeness, not to complete each other, but to enhance each other, not to lose themselves in love, but to find themselves more completely through the mirror of conscious relationship. The love she is now capable of both giving and receiving is characterized by what she has come to understand as conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Every day, every moment, every interaction becomes an opportunity to choose love rather than to be driven by love, to offer love rather than to demand love, to express love rather than to seek love as validation of her worth. This conscious choosing creates a quality of relationship that is both more free and more committed than what she experienced before. It is more free because it is based on genuine choice rather than psychological compulsion, because both people are in the relationship because they want to be there rather than because they feel they need to be there. It is more committed because the choice to love is made fresh each day, renewed through conscious decision rather than maintained through habit or fear of being alone. She understands now that the deepest intimacy is not about having no boundaries, but about having healthy boundaries that can be consciously lowered when it serves love to do so. The most profound connection is not about merging into oneness, but about two distinct beings choosing to share their distinctness. The greatest security in relationship is not about guarantees and promises, but about the day-by-day choice that two whole people make to continue choosing each other. The journey through solitude has taught her to distinguish between love and attachment, between connection and codependence, between intimacy and enmeshment. Love, she now knows, seeks the highest good of the beloved, even when that good might not serve her own immediate desires. Attachment seeks to possess, to control, to keep the beloved in whatever form feels most comfortable or familiar. Love trusts the beloved's process, even when it is difficult to witness. Attachment tries to manage the beloved's process to minimize her own discomfort. This distinction transforms how she approaches the inevitable challenges that arise in any authentic relationship. Where once she might have tried to fix problems by changing herself or changing the other person, now she understands that most relationships' difficulties are opportunities for both people to grow into greater authenticity, to practice loving from a more conscious place, to choose each other again from a deeper level of understanding. The gold she has mined in the depths of solitude, the unshakable knowing of her own worth, the capacity to be happy in her own company, the ability to validate herself rather than seeking validation from others, becomes the foundation upon which healthy relationship can be built. She no longer approaches partnership as someone who needs to be saved, but as someone who has saved herself, and is interested in sharing that salvation with someone who has done similar work. This transformation extends beyond romantic relationship to every form of human connection in her life. Her friendships become more authentic because she is no longer performing versions of herself designed to win approval. Her professional relationships become more effective because she is no longer seeking external validation for her competence. Her family relationships become more honest because she is no longer trying to be who she thinks they need her to be to earn their love. The woman who has completed the journey of individuation carries within her a quality of presence that heals others not through trying to heal them, but through the simple fact of being healed herself. Her wholeness gives others permission to discover their own wholeness. Her self-love creates space for others to practice self-love. Her happiness in solitude demonstrates that such happiness is possible, that it is not necessary to sacrifice oneself to be worthy of love, that it is not selfish to take care of one's own needs. She has learned that the most generous thing she can do for the world is to be genuinely happy, genuinely whole, genuinely at peace with herself. This happiness is not the shallow pleasure that comes from external circumstances, but the deep contentment that comes from being aligned with her own truth, from living in integrity with her own values, from honoring her own authentic nature even when it is inconvenient or misunderstood by others. Jung understood that individuation is not just a personal process, but a service to the collective, that each person who does the work of becoming whole contributes to the healing of the human community. The woman who has found herself becomes a beacon for others who are still searching, a living example that the journey is possible, that the treasure can be found, that the return can be made successfully. She no longer needs others to understand her journey or validate her transformation. The changes are evident in the quality of her presence, in the decisions she makes, in the way she moves through the world. She radiates the quiet authority of someone who has done the deep work, who has faced her shadow and integrated it, who has connected with the self that lies beneath the ego's constructions and defenses. The love she offers now flows from abundance rather than scarcity, from wholeness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion. She can love generously because she is not trying to get anything in return. She can love freely because she is not afraid of being abandoned. She has already proven to herself that she can survive and thrive in solitude. She can love authentically because she no longer needs to perform versions of herself designed to win approval. This quality of love creates entirely different kinds of relationships. Relationships between two sovereign beings who choose to share their sovereignty, between two complete people who choose to share their completeness, between two individuals who have done their own work and can therefore meet each other from clarity rather than projection, from wholeness rather than neediness, from love rather than fear. The return from the underworld of the psyche brings with it a new understanding of what relationship can be when both people approach it from wholeness. It can be a celebration rather than a remedy, an enhancement rather than a completion, a choice rather than a compulsion. It can be a space where both people continue to grow and evolve and discover new aspects of themselves through the mirror of conscious connection. She understands now that the happiest relationships are not between people who need each other, but between people who choose each other, not between people who complete each other, but between people who complement each other, not between people who can't live without each other, but between people who could live without each other but choose not to because they enjoy each other's company too much. The treasure she brings back from her journey is not something she can give to others, but something she can share with others. The knowledge that it is possible to be whole, the experience of being genuinely happy in one's own company, the understanding that love is not something we lack, but something we are. She becomes a living invitation for others to take their own journey, to do their own work, to discover their own treasure. The hero's return is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the wisdom gained in solitude can be shared in connection, one in which the love discovered within can be expressed in relationship, one in which the wholeness achieved individually can contribute to the creation of whole relationships, whole families, whole communities. She moves through the world now as someone who has remembered something essential about the nature of love, that it is not a hunger to be satisfied, but a gift to be given, not a need to be met, but a choice to be made, not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be celebrated. She carries within her the unshakable knowledge that she is already everything she was looking for in others, that the love she sought outside herself was growing inside herself all along, waiting for her recognition, waiting for her return, waiting for her homecoming to the truth of who she has always been. The circle is complete, but it is not a closed circle. It is a spiral that has brought her back to where she started, but at a higher level of understanding, with a deeper capacity for love, with a greater to contribute to the healing and wholeness of the world. She has learned that the path to authentic relationship leads through the heart of solitude, that the way to love others deeply is to first love herself completely, that the secret to being chosen by others is to first choose herself. And in this choosing, this complete embrace of her own worth, her own complexity, her own mysterious and irreducible selfhood, she discovers that she has become someone worth choosing, someone capable of the kind of love that heals rather than wounds, that liberates rather than imprisons, that celebrates rather than diminishes the beloved. The return is complete, and the real love story, the one between two whole beings who choose each other from abundance rather than need, can finally begin.